Welcome to Olga and Ray Sleep. Ray is already fast asleep beside me, but I want to share a special story with you tonight. It begins on a rain-slick night in a city full of secrets. It is a story about a boy who could hear what others could not. So, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's listen to The Quiet Arrival. The Quiet Arrival. He arrived on a rain-slick night, the kind of weather that made the city smell like wet stone and old paper. The hospital lights hummed. The nurses moved with the practiced choreography of people who had seen too many beginnings and endings. And his mother, exhausted and fierce, held him to her chest as if she could teach him the world by the warmth of her skin. The first sound he registered was not the cry that escaped his throat, but a chorus of small, private noises. The nurse's worry about a late rent, the janitor's memory of a son who had left for another country, the doctor's quiet calculation of the next shift. They were not words yet, only impressions that braided with the smell of antiseptic and the rhythm of a heart. He did not know then that the world had opened to him in a way it did not for others. He only knew that the room was full of voices that were not spoken aloud. As he grew, the voices multiplied. At first they were like the background hiss of a radio, a neighbor's grocery list, a child's counting game, the cashier's impatience. Then they sharpened into sentences and images that arrived without sound. He learned early that the world contained two kinds of speech, the one that left mouths and the one that lived behind eyes. He learned to fold himself small and to listen without answering. His parents called him thoughtful, his teachers called him quiet. He learned to hide the way his attention could slip into other people's heads, to keep his face neutral when a classmate's jealousy flared like a small, hot thing. When a teacher's fatigue made her voice brittle, when a friend's laughter masked a private grief. The gift, or the burden, depending on the day, shaped the architecture of his childhood. It made him an excellent student in ways that felt both miraculous and lonely. He could anticipate a teacher's line of reasoning, not by guessing, but by feeling the pattern of thought that led to an answer. In math, he saw the logic of proofs as a sequence of intentions. In literature, he felt the author's hesitation between two metaphors. When classmates whispered about a test, he knew which problems would be emphasized because he could sense the teacher's worry about standards and the principal's pressure to raise scores. He did not cheat. He learned instead to study the way a composer studies a score, to rehearse the thought patterns he sensed until they became his own. At home, the gift made chores efficient in a way that felt almost like magic. He could sense the exact moment his mother's patience frayed and step in with a small kindness before a quarrel began. He learned to time his father's coffee so that the mug arrived when the man's mind needed a pause. He could read the rhythm of a room and arrange small domestic economies, which light bulb to replace before a guest arrived, which route through the market would avoid a vendor's bad mood, which words would soothe a neighbor's worry about a sick child. These were not grand acts. They were the quiet, practical uses of a knowledge that made him useful and, paradoxically, more alone. School was a different landscape. Children are merciless in their curiosity, and curiosity can become cruelty when it seeks to name what it does not understand. He learned early to answer questions with a calm that did not invite further probing. When a boy mimicked his accent, or when a girl laughed at the way he folded his hands, he felt the sting of their private thoughts like a small, hot stone in his chest. He learned to keep his face blank, to let the noise wash over him without letting it change him. The skill of concealment became a second nature, a practiced smile, a neutral tone, a refusal to comment on what he knew. He learned to be a mirror that reflected only what others wanted to see. There were moments of tenderness that cut through the isolation. Once, when he was 7, a classmate named Jonah sat beside him on the playground bench and, without looking at him, said, "You're quiet." The boy's voice was small and honest. He could have answered with the truth that he heard Jonah's father's worry about losing his job, that he knew the exact time Jonah's mother would call, but instead he said, "I like the swings." Jonah nodded and pushed off, and for a few minutes the world narrowed to the simple physics of motion and the small, shared pleasure of wind in the face. Those minutes were rare and precious. They taught him that not all connections required confession. As adolescence arrived, the voices inside him grew more complex. Teenagers are a storm of contradictions, bravado braided with fear, desire braided with shame. He could hear the private calculations that accompanied flirtations, the small cruelties that were rehearsed as jokes, the private vows to change that dissolved by mourning. The knowledge made him more cautious. He retreated into himself, not because he wanted to be distant, but because intimacy had become a dangerous thing. To know someone's secret was to hold a weapon you could not safely wield. He learned to be a careful listener, to offer help without revealing the source of his insight, to let people believe what they needed to believe about themselves. The academic advantages continued. He excelled in debate because he could sense an opponent's rhetorical moves before they were made. He anticipated counterarguments and shaped his own positions with a clarity that felt like preemption. In mock trials, he could read a juror's flicker of doubt and adjust his tone to meet it. He learned law not as a set of rules, but as a language of intentions. What a statute wanted to do, what a judge feared, what a jury hoped to see. The law felt to him like a map of human motives, and he learned to navigate it with a kind of moral geometry that made him both formidable and, in private, exhausted. His desire to become a lawyer was not accidental. He had seen how words could be used to hide truth, and how institutions could bend narratives until they fit a convenient frame. He wanted to be someone who could hold a mirror up to falsehood and say, plainly, "This is not what happened." He wanted to defend those who were misrepresented, to stand between a person and the machinery that could crush them with a rumor or a misread fact. The law promised a place where his peculiar skill could be used for repair, rather than for manipulation. At home, his parents watched him with a mixture of pride and worry. They had emigrated with the hope that their son would have opportunities they had not. They saw his grades, his awards, the way teachers praised his composure, and they felt relief. But they also saw the way he retreated after long days, the way his eyes sometimes looked through them as if he were listening to a conversation they could not hear. They asked gentle questions and accepted gentle answers. He told them he was tired from studying. They nodded and made him tea. He did not tell them about the nights he lay awake, listening to the city's private thoughts like a radio tuned to too many stations. There were practical lessons, too. He learned to manage money by sensing a landlord's impatience and negotiating a small delay in rent before the man's temper hardened. He learned to navigate bureaucracy by anticipating the clerk's mood and bringing the exact paper that would make the line move. These were small economies of attention that made life smoother. They were also moral tests. When he could have used his knowledge to exploit a weakness, he often chose not to. He developed a personal ethic that read like a set of rules in a notebook he kept hidden. Do not reveal what you hear. Do not use knowledge to harm. Use insight to protect the vulnerable. By the time he applied to law school, his reputation as a careful, brilliant student preceded him. He wrote essays that were precise and humane, and he spoke in interviews with a calm that suggested both confidence and restraint. He was accepted to a program that prized public interest law, and he felt, for the first time, that his life had a direction that matched his strange capacity. He would learn the language of rights and duties, of precedent and principle, and he would use that language to defend those who had been misread by the world. The early years of law school were a crucible. He learned to translate the private impressions he gathered into public arguments that could stand up in court. He practiced cross-examination with a discipline that made his classmates both admire and fear him. He did not reveal his secret. He did not need to. The law rewarded preparation, and his preparation was meticulous. He read not only cases but the footnotes, the dissenting opinions, the marginalia that revealed a judge's private hesitation. He learned to craft narratives that honored truth without exposing the private thoughts that had helped him find it. There were costs. The more he learned to shape public truth, the more he felt the weight of private knowledge. He carried the world's secrets like a ledger of small, aching facts. He could not unhear a child's fear or a neighbor's shame. He learned to compartmentalize, to set aside the voices that were not his to carry, but the effort left him tired in a way that sleep could not fix. He found solace in small rituals. A walk at dawn when the city was quiet, a cup of coffee made with the care his father had taught him, a notebook where he wrote rules and reminders to himself. By the time he graduated, he had a clear plan. He would become a lawyer who took only honest cases, those where the client's truth could be defended without bending the law. He would not be a gladiator for hire. He would be a steward of justice. The choice was both moral and practical. His gift made him uniquely suited to defend the misrepresented, to see through the fog of rumor, and to find the facts that mattered. He imagined a life where his knowledge could be a balm rather than a blade. The world, however, had a way of complicating even the most carefully drawn plans. The city he loved was a place of bright possibility and quiet corruption, of kindness and small cruelties. He would soon learn that the law could be both a shield and a cage, and that the truth he could read in people's minds would sometimes reveal not only private sorrow, but the machinery of power itself. For now, though, he walked into his first courtroom with a steady step and a notebook in his pocket, the rules he had written there like a promise to himself. Protect the vulnerable, honor consent, and never use knowledge to dominate. The promise felt fragile and fierce, like a small light in a dark room. He did not yet know how long it would hold. The first cases. The first courtroom smelled of old wood and lemon polish, the kind of scent that made history feel like a tangible thing you could touch. He learned the rhythms quickly. The clerk's soft thump of the gavel, the way a judge's eyes narrowed when a lawyer's argument had holes, the polite, rehearsed cadence of prosecutors who had learned to make certainty sound inevitable. He moved through those rhythms with a careful grace, the way someone who has practiced a dance steps into a room and knows where the floor will creak. His gift made the work of preparation different from everyone else's. Where other young lawyers spent nights memorizing statutes and precedent, he spent nights listening. He would sit in the library and, without opening a book, feel the outlines of a professor's emphasis, the private anxieties of a clerk who would later grade a brief, the unspoken priorities of a judge who had once been a public defender and still carried the memory of clients who had been failed by the system. Those impressions were not a substitute for study. They were a map. He used them to choose which cases to read first, which lines of argument to test, which witnesses to prepare with extra care. In practice, the advantage was subtle and humane rather than spectacular. He could sense when a witness was rehearsing a memory that had been smoothed into a story, and when a witness's confidence was a brittle armor. He could feel the prosecutor's private certainty that a plea bargain would be accepted, and the juror's quiet fear of being judged for a compassionate verdict. He used that knowledge to shape questions that invited truth rather than to trap. Cross-examination, in his hands, became less an exercise in demolition and more a careful excavation. He asked the questions that allowed a witness to find the truth they had been trying to hold on to. Clients noticed. People who had been dismissed as liars or troublemakers found, in his presence, a lawyer who listened in a way that felt like belief. He did not promise miracles. He promised attention and a refusal to let a story be flattened into a headline. He took on cases that others considered hopeless. A factory worker accused of embezzlement because a ledger had been misread. A mother accused of neglect because a social worker had misinterpreted a cultural practice. A teenager whose prank had been criminalized because the system needed a scapegoat. In each case, he used his gift to reconstruct the texture of events, not by exposing private thoughts to the court, but by finding the facts that corroborated a client's account. There were practical, everyday ways his ability made life smoother and more effective. In negotiations, he could sense the exact moment an opposing counsel's posture shifted from bluff to concession. He would pause, let silence do its work, and then press where the other side had already conceded internally. In client interviews, he could feel the precise phrase that would coax a reticent witness into remembering a crucial detail. In depositions, he could sense when a witness's memory was honest and when it had been shaped by fear or coaching. These were not tricks, they were tools of clarity. He learned to use them with restraint, to let the law do the heavy lifting while he provided the subtle guidance that made truth legible. The ethical code he had written for himself in adolescence hardened into practice. He refused to use his ability to plant ideas, to fabricate testimony, or to manipulate jurors. He would not, for example, step into a juror's mind and nudge them toward a verdict. The temptation had been there in the early days, a quick way to win a case, to save a client from a sentence that would ruin a life, but he had seen the corrosive effect of such shortcuts in the private thoughts he carried. Power used without consent turned people into instruments, and he had vowed, in the quiet of his notebook, never to be an instrument maker. Instead, he developed techniques that respected autonomy. He learned to translate impressions into questions that invited consent. If he sensed a witness's fear, he would ask permission to pause, to offer a break, to let the witness gather themselves. If he felt a juror's private bias, he would craft an argument that addressed the bias openly, not by manipulation, but by reframing the issue so the juror could see the human stakes. He taught himself to be transparent about his methods with clients. He would say, "I listen carefully. I will not tell you what someone is thinking, but I will help you find the facts that make your story credible." That honesty built trust. His reputation grew slowly, the way a river widens by steady flow rather than sudden flood. Word spread among community groups and legal aid clinics. Here was a lawyer who took cases others had abandoned, who treated clients as people rather than problems. He began to work with public defenders and nonprofit organizations, offering pro bono hours for cases where the stakes were high and the resources low. The work was exhausting and often thankless, but it was also the kind of labor that made his life feel aligned with the promise he had made to himself, to use his knowledge to protect the vulnerable. There were practical benefits beyond the courtroom. He could read the mood of a negotiation room and arrange small gestures that eased tension. A timely cup of coffee, a quiet joke that acknowledged shared fatigue, a pause that allowed tempers to cool. He could sense when a colleague was on the verge of burnout and offer to take a case load for a month. He became, in the office, a kind of quiet anchor, someone who could steady a team by anticipating the small human failures that often derailed legal work. Missed deadlines, frayed tempers, miscommunications. His presence made the practice more humane. But the gift also deepened his solitude. The more he listened, the more he carried. He knew the private griefs of clients who had trusted him, a father's shame at not being able to provide, a mother's fear that her child would be taken away, a young man's terror that a single mistake would define his life. He could not unhear those things. He learned to compartmentalize, to set aside the voices that were not his to carry, but the effort left him tired in a way that sleep could not fix. He found solace in small rituals: a walk at dawn when the city was quiet, a cup of coffee made with the care his father had taught him, a notebook where he wrote rules and reminders to himself. Romantic life, when it came, was complicated. Intimacy required a kind of mutual vulnerability he had long avoided. He could sense the private calculations that accompanied flirtation, the fear of being judged, the hope that a partner would stay, and the knowledge made him cautious. He dated, briefly and carefully, choosing partners who valued honesty and who could hold the kind of silence he sometimes needed. He learned to ask for consent in new ways, not only for physical intimacy, but for emotional proximity. He would say, "I need to tell you something about how I listen to the world," and he would watch the other person's face for the private thought that said yes or no. Those conversations were awkward and brave, and they taught him that love required a different kind of courage than the courtroom, the courage to be known without being used. As his practice matured, he began to specialize. He took on defamation cases and wrongful accusation suits, the kinds of matters where reputation and truth were entangled in public spectacle. He became known for a particular kind of defense, meticulous, humane, and unafraid to confront institutional narratives. When a small business owner was accused of fraud because a competitor had doctored invoices, he reconstructed the timeline by interviewing clerks, reading the cadence of emails, and, when necessary, gently pressing a witness to remember a detail they had buried. When a teacher was accused of misconduct because of a rumor that had metastasized through social media, he traced the rumor's path and found the original misinterpretation that had been amplified by fear. In each case, he did not expose private thoughts in court. He used his impressions to find corroborating facts, to locate witnesses, to reconstruct events. Success brought attention. Local papers wrote about the lawyer who defended the misrepresented. Community groups invited him to speak about ethics and the law. He accepted invitations selectively, always mindful of the risk that publicity could turn his gift into a commodity. He refused offers from sensationalist shows that wanted to dramatize his ability. He refused, too, lucrative corporate clients whose interests conflicted with his moral code. the choices were not always easy. Money would have made life simpler, allowed him to help more people, to support his parents without worry. But he had learned, early on, that compromise could erode the very thing he wanted to protect, the integrity of his listening. There were nights when the weight of knowledge felt unbearable. He would lie awake and hear the city's private chorus like a tide that would not recede. He would think of the clients whose lives he had helped salvage and of the ones he had lost. He would think of the small, human acts that had made the difference. A witness who had been coaxed into remembering a detail, a prosecutor who had been persuaded to re-examine evidence, a judge who had been shown the human cost of a sentence. Those memories were balm. They reminded him why he had chosen this path. And yet, beneath the steady work of law and the quiet victories, a darker current ran. The more he listened, the more he understood the machinery of power, the private calculations of officials who bent rules for convenience, the bureaucratic rationales that justified harm, the quiet compromises that made injustice tolerable. He saw how institutions protected themselves by shaping narratives, by privileging certain voices and silencing others. The knowledge did not make him cynical, it made him restless. He believed in the law's capacity for repair, but he also saw its limits. The law could correct individual wrongs, but it could not always uproot the systems that produced those wrongs. For now, he stayed within the law's bounds, using his gift to defend and to repair. He built a small practice that was known for integrity and for the quiet tenacity of its work. He kept his notebook of rules close, and he added to it, "Do not weaponize knowledge. Do not betray trust. Use insight to illuminate, not to dominate." The promise felt both fragile and fierce, like a small light in a dark room. He did not yet know how long it would hold, nor did he know the shape of the storm that would one day test the limits of his restraint. For the moment, he walked the courthouse steps with a steady step, ready to listen, ready to argue, and ready to defend those who had been misread by the world. The accusation and the first breach. The case that changed everything began, at first, like the others. A client in need, a file on a cluttered desk, a story that did not fit the neat categories the police preferred. His client, a community organizer named Matteo, ran a small legal clinic that helped migrants and low-income families navigate housing disputes. Matteo was blunt, generous, and habitually late for meetings. He had a laugh that filled a room and a stubborn refusal to accept that the world's rules were immutable. When the city's housing authority announced a sudden audit of several nonprofit clinics, Matteo joked that the auditors must have run out of paperwork to shred. 2 weeks later, he was arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud. The authority claimed that funds had been diverted, that invoices had been falsified, that a pattern of deception had been uncovered. The arrest felt wrong in the way that certain smells feel wrong in a kitchen, a subtle, immediate signal that something had been burned. He met Matteo in a holding room that smelled of bleach and old coffee. The man's hands trembled when he spoke. His eyes were bright with indignation and fear. He told the lawyer the story he had always told. The clinic's books were messy but honest, that the invoices in question had been for community outreach events, that the signatures were genuine but had been misattributed in a hurried audit. He spoke with the blunt, human logic of someone who had spent his life solving small, practical problems. The lawyer listened, and as he listened, the private chorus inside him began to hum with a different frequency. The thoughts of the auditors, the clerk who had filed the complaint, the municipal official who had pushed the audit through. He did not reveal what he heard. He never did. But the impressions sharpened into a suspicion that the arrest was not merely bureaucratic error. There was a pattern of attention around Mateo that felt like a net. Surveillance, targeted inquiries, a quiet insistence that the case be pursued. He filed motions, requested documents, and prepared for a hearing. The legal work was meticulous and familiar. He reconstructed ledgers, subpoenaed emails, and found witnesses who could corroborate Mateo's account. Yet the sense of a larger force at work would not leave him. It was a pressure that had nothing to do with the law's ordinary machinery. It felt like the slow, patient hand of a system that could bend facts to fit a narrative. The first visit from the men in plain clothes came on a rainless afternoon. They arrived at the office with the polite brusqueness of people who had been trained to make presence feel like inevitability. Their badges were not the kind that belonged to municipal auditors. They were the kind that belonged to agencies whose names were spoken in hushed tones. He felt their approach before they spoke. A cluster of thoughts like a low-frequency hum, the professional detachment of people who had rehearsed their lines, the private certainty that the law's machinery could be used to tidy inconvenient truths. They asked questions about Mateo's funding sources, about the clinic's donors, about his own clients. Their words were careful, their minds were not. He listened to them the way he had learned to listen in courtrooms, not to catch them in a trap, but to map the shape of their certainty. He felt the outline of a narrative they had already decided upon, that the clinic was a front, that the funds had been diverted to shadowy networks, that Mateo was a convenient scapegoat for a municipal problem. The impressions were not mere gossip. They were the architecture of intent. He left the meeting with a polite refusal to answer certain questions without counsel, and with a new, private alarm. The men's thoughts contained references to files and operations he had never seen, to names that were not public, to a network of influence that reached into procurement offices and into the city's quieter corridors of power. That night he sat alone in his small kitchen, the city's lights a constellation beyond the window, and felt the weight of what he had heard. The law could defend a person against a charge. It could not always dismantle a system that used legal forms as instruments of control. He had always believed that the law, properly used, could be a tool of repair. But the men's private certainty suggested a different truth. That power could be organized to manufacture guilt, to create narratives that served interests rather than justice. The knowledge did not make him cynical. It made him restless. He had spent years learning to use his gift to find facts and to protect the vulnerable. Now he faced a question that had no precedent in his notebook. What do you do when the machinery of the state itself becomes the instrument of injustice? The answer that rose in him was not immediate. He slept poorly and walked the city at dawn, listening to the private thoughts of commuters and vendors, trying to find a moral compass in the chorus. The compass pointed, slowly and insistently, toward a radical conclusion. If institutions could be weaponized, then perhaps the only way to protect the vulnerable was to expose the architecture that enabled the weaponization. The thought arrived like a cold wind, not merely to defend Mateo within the law's bounds, but to understand the system's inner workings well enough to dismantle the parts that made such abuses possible. He did not decide to become a saboteur in a single, dramatic moment. The decision accreted like sediment, a series of small, moral calculations that hardened into resolve. He began, at first, with surveillance of his own. He read the minds of the auditors who had signed the complaint and found, beneath the professional posture, a pattern of incentives. Promotions tied to performance metrics, bonuses for efficiency that translated into fewer questions asked, a culture that rewarded tidy outcomes over messy truth. He listened to the municipal officials' private calculations and found a ledger of favors and debts, contracts awarded to certain firms, procurement decisions that favored political allies, a quiet economy of influence that made inconvenient clinics easy targets. The knowledge was intoxicating in a way that frightened him. For the first time, his gift revealed not only private sorrow and petty cruelty, but the structural logic of power. He could map the network, who benefited from a clinic's closure, which contractors profited from municipal contracts, which officials had incentives to produce quick, visible wins. The map made the system legible in a way that law books could not. It also made him aware of the scale of what he contemplated. To dismantle such a system would require more than courtroom skill. It would require infiltration, information, leverage. He began to experiment with methods that had once felt like moral taboos. He used his ability to anticipate the movements of security personnel, to know when a file would be moved, to sense the private hesitation of a clerk who might be persuaded to share a scanned invoice. He did not, at first, use his gift to plant thoughts or to coerce. He used it to time actions, when to request a document, when to file a motion, when to press a journalist with a question that would open a seam. He learned to move through bureaucracies like a shadow, slipping through gaps created by human fatigue and institutional blind spots. The law remained his public instrument. His private methods became a kind of espionage that skirted the edges of legality. The first breach was small and surgical. A procurement file, misfiled in a municipal archive, contained an invoice that linked a contractor to a shell company with ties to the official who had pushed the audit. He had felt the clerk's private hesitation the week before, a thought about a sick child and a need for extra cash, and he had left a small, anonymous envelope on the clerk's desk, a note that said only, "There is a way to help." The clerk, whose private calculus had been exposed to him, later admitted to slipping a scanned copy of the invoice into a folder he had been asked to prepare for a public records request. The document, once in his hands, became evidence that undermined the official narrative. Mateo's charges were weakened. The audit's logic began to fray. The success tasted like both victory and poison. He had used leverage that felt ethically ambiguous, a quiet nudge to a vulnerable person who had been tempted by a small kindness. He had not forced the clerk. He had only created a moment where the clerk's private need aligned with the public good. The ledger in his head recorded the action with a new, uneasy line. Do not use knowledge to coerce. Do not create dependencies. Yet the line did not erase the fact that the action had worked. Mateo's case improved. The clinic's closure was delayed. The municipal narrative lost its tidy shape. The breach also revealed the scale of what he might do. If a single misfiled invoice could unravel a narrative, then a pattern of leaks and exposures could destabilize the system that produced such narratives. He began to imagine a campaign not of violence, but of revelation, targeted exposures that would make the machinery of power legible to the public, that would force institutions to answer for the incentives they created. The idea was seductive and dangerous. It promised a way to protect the vulnerable by making the system accountable. It also promised to turn him into a figure who operated outside the law, who used secrets as weapons, and who could be tempted to shape outcomes by means other than truth. He kept the thought to himself for weeks, testing its edges in the quiet of his apartment. He rehearsed scenarios. What would happen if procurement files were leaked to journalists? How would the public react if a pattern of favoritism were exposed? Could the law, once armed with evidence, correct the structural incentives that produced abuse? He also rehearsed the counterfactuals. The risk of harm to innocents, the possibility that exposure could be weaponized by others, the moral corrosion that comes from using secrets as leverage. In the end, the choice he made was not a single moral leap, but a series of guarded steps. He would not become a nihilist who sought to burn the world down. He would become, instead, a surgical instrument, infiltrator, archivist, and when necessary, blackmailer of systems rather than people. His aim was not to humiliate individuals, but to dismantle the incentives that made institutions cruel. He would use espionage and leverage as tools to force transparency, to return power to communities, and to protect those who had no other recourse. The first phase of the campaign was careful and small, targeted exposures, strategic leaks to trusted journalists, and the cultivation of allies within municipal offices who were tired of the system's moral compromises. He learned to move like a ghost through networks of influence, to time requests, and to anticipate the private calculations of those he encountered. The law remained his public shield. His private methods became a shadow practice that he justified with a single, stubborn conviction. If the system would not protect the vulnerable, then he would use whatever means were necessary to make the system accountable. The decision set him on a path that would change not only his life, but the shape of the city. It would force him to confront the limits of his own ethics, to test the boundaries between justice and vengeance, and to discover how fragile the line is between using power to protect and using it to dominate. For now, though, the campaign began with a single, quiet act. A scanned invoice slipped into a folder, a motion filed with new evidence, and a client who walked out of a courtroom with a lighter step. The victory was small and imperfect, but it tasted like possibility. He pressed his palm to his notebook and wrote, in a hand that trembled with both fear and resolve, "Expose the architecture, protect the vulnerable, do not become what you fight." The words felt like a prayer and a warning, and the city outside his window hummed with the private thoughts of people who had no idea how close they were to being rearranged. The descent. The victory that saved Mateo's clinic arrived like a small, bright island in a widening sea of complication. The scanned invoice, once revealed, forced a cascade of questions that the municipal auditors could not easily answer. A journalist with a reputation for careful reporting ran the story, and the public pressure that followed made the housing authority's narrative look brittle. Mateo walked out of the courthouse with his shoulders straighter than they had been in weeks. The clinic reopened its doors, and the families it served returned with cautious gratitude. For a while, the city's hum felt less like a threat and more like a chorus of ordinary lives resuming their rhythms. But the success did not settle him. If anything, it sharpened the edges of his resolve. The invoice had been a single thread. When he followed it, he found a weave of favors and incentives that reached into procurement offices, into campaign coffers, into the quiet economies that made municipal decisions predictable and profitable. The system had been engineered to reward tidy outcomes and to punish messy truth. Mateo's case had been a symptom, not an anomaly. The more he listened to the private thoughts of officials and clerks, the more he saw patterns. Incentives that encouraged shortcuts, performance metrics that rewarded appearances over substance, and a culture of mutual protection that insulated wrongdoing behind bureaucratic language. He began to think in larger terms. The law could win individual battles, but it could not, by itself, change the incentives that produced injustice. If he wanted to protect the vulnerable at scale, he would have to make the architecture of power legible to the public. He would have to show how decisions were made, who profited from them, and how narratives were manufactured to justify outcomes. The idea was not merely to expose corruption for its own sake, but to force a structural reckoning, to make transparency unavoidable, and to create political costs for the kinds of institutional slights that had targeted Mateo. The campaign that followed was not a single plan, but a series of converging strategies, each chosen with the care of someone who had learned to weigh consequences. He did not become a vandal of institutions. He became an operator of pressure. He cultivated allies in journalism, in municipal offices, and among clerks who were tired of the moral compromises their jobs demanded. He used his gift to time interventions, to know when a file would be moved, when a clerk would be distracted, when a conversation would reveal a seam that could be pulled. He learned to read the rhythms of power the way he had once read the cadence of a courtroom, not to dominate minds, but to find the factual threads that would make a public case undeniable. Espionage in his hands was a craft of patience rather than spectacle. He did not break into servers or plant bugs. He exploited human patterns. He cultivated small favors, offered discreet help to overburdened clerks, and created moments where a person's private need aligned with the public good. He recruited a handful of insiders, a procurement assistant who resented being used as a conduit for favoritism, a mid-level official who had watched contracts flow to friends, a data analyst who had been told to massage numbers to meet targets. Each ally had their own reasons: moral discomfort, financial strain, the desire for recognition. He did not coerce them. He offered them a way to act that minimized personal risk and maximized public impact. Leaks were surgical and strategic. He fed documents to journalists who had shown integrity and who understood how to contextualize evidence without sensationalism. He timed releases to coincide with council meetings and budget votes so that revelations could not be easily buried. He used the law as a public instrument. Once a pattern of favoritism was documented, he filed public records requests and motions that forced hearings and audits. The combination of legal pressure and public exposure created a feedback loop. Officials who had once relied on opacity found themselves under scrutiny, and the political cost of protecting corrupt practices rose. Blackmail, when it appeared in his toolbox, was a last resort and a moral hazard he treated with dread. He discovered early that threats could be effective in bending a single actor, but they also had corrosive effects on the soul. He used coercive leverage only when a person's continued silence would cause imminent harm to many people and when no other path existed. Even then, he tried to structure the leverage so that it forced accountability rather than humiliation, a choice to resign and cooperate, to return funds, to testify under oath, or to accept public censure. He avoided personal shaming. His aim was to dismantle systems of advantage, not to destroy lives for sport. As the campaign widened, so did the scale of the secrets he encountered. He read the private calculations of mid-level officials and found petty corruption. He read the minds of higher-ups and found rationalizations that sounded like policy. He listened to the thoughts of contractors and found networks of referral and reward. And then, one night, a visit from men whose badges were not municipal, but national changed the tenor of his work. They came with the quiet authority of people who believed themselves to be above ordinary oversight. Their private thoughts were not merely about invoices or promotions. They contained references to operations, to dossiers, to the ways the state could be used to silence inconvenient actors. When he read their minds, he glimpsed a deeper architecture, a security apparatus that could be mobilized to protect interests and to manufacture consent. The knowledge unsettled him. He had always imagined his campaign as a civic corrective: expose corruption, force accountability, strengthen institutions. But the presence of state actors who thought in terms of dossiers and operations suggested a different scale of power, one that could not be undone by a single exposé. If the state itself could be weaponized, then the project of reform required not only transparency, but a reconfiguration of power. He began to imagine a more radical horizon, not merely to make institutions accountable, but to change the social conditions that made centralized power so seductive. The idea that took shape in his mind was dangerous and audacious. He began to think about a world where the trappings of modern accumulation, the concentration of property, the fetishization of efficiency, the commodification of trust, were diminished. He imagined a return to a kind of primitivism, not as a romantic escape, but as a political strategy. A world where people valued direct relationships, where property was limited to what was necessary for life, where trust and mutual aid were the primary currencies. In such a world, the levers of centralized power would be less effective because the incentives that fed them would be weaker. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. It promised a radical leveling of power, but it also threatened to upend lives and institutions in ways he could not fully predict. He knew the history of utopian projects and the violence they sometimes entailed. He also knew the slow violence of the status quo: communities displaced, services privatized, reputations destroyed by manufactured narratives. The moral calculus was brutal. Was it better to tinker with institutions and accept incremental gains, or to pursue a radical rupture that might free many but harm others in the process? He did not decide in a single night. Instead, his tactics evolved along a spectrum. At first, he focused on transparency and accountability: leaks, legal pressure, public hearings. When those measures met resistance from security services and entrenched interests, he escalated to more aggressive forms of disruption, exposing networks of influence that made procurement predictable, sabotaging the reputations of firms that profited from municipal contracts, and using targeted blackmail to force resignations and confessions. Each escalation was accompanied by a private audit of consequences: who would be harmed, who would be protected, and whether the public good justified the means. The campaign began to have real effects. A procurement director resigned after a series of articles revealed a pattern of favoritism. A contractor lost a multi-million-dollar bid when documents showed collusion. A municipal official was indicted after a whistleblower testified under oath. The city's political landscape shifted. Citizens who had once felt powerless began to organize, using the network of community clinics and the archive of evidence to demand reforms. The law, when armed with documents and testimony, could still do work. But the deeper architecture, the security apparatus that had once seemed peripheral, began to push back. He felt the push as a tightening in the city's air. Surveillance increased in subtle ways. More plainclothes officers at council meetings, a sudden interest in the legal clinic's donors, a bureaucratic zeal for audits that felt performative. He read the thoughts of those who came to question him and found a new layer of calculation, not merely to defend a narrative, but to neutralize a threat. The state's logic was not always malevolent in the minds he read. Often it was framed as duty, as the necessity of order. That framing made it harder to argue with facts alone. He realized that to change the system, he would have to change the story people told themselves about order and safety. In private, the campaign took a toll. His relationships frayed. Matteo, grateful but wary, asked him to slow down. The clinic could not be a lightning rod forever. Friends who had once admired his tenacity began to distance themselves, afraid of being associated with a man who trafficked in secrets. Mara, who had been his closest companion, confronted him one night on the roof of the clinic. She did not accuse him of wrongdoing. She asked him what he wanted the world to be. He answered with the language of systems and incentives, of property and trust, and she listened with a sorrow that felt like a verdict. "You can't remake the world by yourself," she said, "and you can't remake it by breaking people to pieces." Her words landed like stones. He heard her private thought then, not a sentence but a feeling, fear for him, fear for the people he might hurt, and a hope that he would find a way to keep his humanity. The thought pierced him more than any public accusation. He had always tried to avoid harming innocents. Now he saw how easily collateral damage could accumulate. A contractor's employees lost jobs when a firm was exposed. A clerk who had leaked documents faced legal peril. A whistleblower's family endured threats. The ledger of consequences grew heavy. Still, the campaign continued. He refined his methods to minimize harm, prioritize exposing institutional patterns over humiliating individuals, offer legal protection to whistleblowers, and use public hearings to force systemic reforms rather than personal vendettas. He cultivated journalists who understood the ethics of reporting and who would not sensationalize. He built a small network of allies who could provide legal and emotional support to those who risked exposure. He tried, in other words, to build a movement that could translate revelations into durable change without descending into revenge. And yet the deeper question remained. Could a single person, even one who could read minds, steer a society toward a more primitive ethic of trust and sufficiency without becoming the very kind of power he opposed? The thought haunted him in the quiet hours. He had begun his work to protect the vulnerable, to defend the misrepresented, to make institutions answerable. Now he stood at a crossroads where the means and the ends blurred. The city's lights below him looked like a constellation of small lives, each with its private chorus. He pressed his palm to his notebook and wrote, in a hand that trembled with both conviction and doubt, "Change the incentives. Protect the innocent. Do not become the monster you fight." The sentence felt like a vow and a warning, and the night answered with the private thoughts of a city that had no idea how close it was to being remade. The turning point. The city had begun to feel like a living archive of choices, each street a ledger of favors and debts. He moved through it with the practiced caution of someone who had learned to read the invisible ink of motive. The campaign that had begun as a defense for Mateo's clinic had widened into a project that touched procurement offices, campaign coffers, and the quiet corridors where decisions were made in the name of efficiency. Each revelation produced a ripple: resignations, audits, a few indictments. Citizens who had once felt powerless found a vocabulary for outrage. For a while, the work felt like repair. Then the state pushed back. The first signs were subtle. A plainclothes officer at a council meeting who lingered too long in the back, a sudden audit of the clinic's donors, a municipal IT request that asked for logs and access in a way that felt invasive. He read the minds of the men who came to question him and found not only professional duty, but a private calculus that framed his actions as a threat to order. Their thoughts were not merely about stopping leaks. They were about preserving a system that, in their view, kept the city functioning. The language they used in their heads, dossiers, containment, neutralize, had the cold efficiency of people trained to think in contingencies. The escalation forced him to change tactics. Transparency and legal pressure had worked against municipal corruption because those systems still responded to public scrutiny. The security apparatus, however, operated on different logics: secrecy, plausible deniability, and the ability to reframe dissent as disorder. He realized that exposing documents and filing motions would not be enough. If the state could manufacture narratives and mobilize resources to silence inconvenient actors, then the campaign needed to operate at a different level. It needed to alter incentives, to make opacity costly, and to create alternative structures of trust that could survive a crackdown. He began to think in terms of networks rather than cases. The clinics, the apprentices, the journalists, the clerks who had slipped him documents, they were nodes in a system that could be made resilient. He formalized channels for whistleblowers, created secure ways to transmit evidence, and built legal shields that could protect those who risked exposure. He trained allies in basic operational security: how to avoid surveillance, how to compartmentalize knowledge, how to use analog methods when digital traces were dangerous. The work was less glamorous than the headlines. It was the slow, patient labor of building redundancy. At the same time, his private methods grew bolder. He had always avoided direct coercion, but the presence of a security apparatus that could weaponize the law against vulnerable people changed the calculus. He began to use leverage more aggressively, not to humiliate individuals, but to force institutional concessions. A procurement director who refused to cooperate found his private tax irregularities quietly exposed to a journalist who understood the ethics of reporting. A contractor who had profited from collusion saw key bids rescinded when documents revealed a pattern of favoritism. He structured these exposures to produce public hearings and legal consequences rather than personal ruin. Resignations with admissions, restitution agreements, and public apologies that rewired incentives. The moral cost was real. He watched as employees of exposed firms lost jobs, as families felt the ripple effects of scandal, and as whistleblowers endured threats. He tried to mitigate harm by offering legal aid, relocation assistance, and psychological support. He insisted that every exposure be accompanied by a plan for repair: community funds to replace lost wages, retraining programs, and public forums where affected workers could be heard. The ledger in his notebook grew heavy with caveats and contingencies. He wrote rules for himself and for his allies: minimize collateral damage, prioritize systemic change, protect the vulnerable who might be harmed by exposure. Even so, the campaign's logic began to shift in ways that unsettled him. The more he dismantled the visible architecture of corruption, the more he encountered the deeper, cultural forces that sustained it. A society that prized accumulation, a political economy that rewarded spectacle, and a public discourse that equated order with centralized control. He read the private thoughts of officials who defended the status quo not out of greed, but out of fear. Fear that rapid change would produce chaos, that markets would collapse, that services would fail. Those fears were not irrational. They were the practical anxieties of people who had to manage complex systems. The realization complicated his moral clarity. It was in that complicated space that the idea of a more radical horizon took root. He began to imagine not merely reform, but a reorientation of values. A world where accumulation was limited, where property was scaled to need, where trust and mutual aid replaced the currency of contracts and litigation. The vision was not a nostalgic fantasy of returning to caves and fires. It was a political program that sought to reduce the scale of centralized power by shrinking the incentives that fed it. If procurement rents and concentrated wealth were the fuel for institutional capture, then reducing those rents would make capture harder. The plan that emerged from this vision was audacious and dangerous. It combined three strands: disruption of centralized infrastructures that enabled extraction, creation of decentralized networks that could meet basic needs, and a cultural campaign to revalue sufficiency over accumulation. Practically, it meant sabotaging the mechanisms that allowed large-scale profiteering, not by violence, but by making them unreliable and costly, while simultaneously building resilient local systems for food, water, and mutual aid. The aim was to make the city less hospitable to the kinds of centralized control that had enabled the abuses he had fought. He began to test the edges of this strategy. Small acts of sabotage were surgical. A procurement database corrupted with innocuous but time-consuming errors that forced audits and slowed corrupt contracts. A pattern of anonymous complaints that triggered oversight into a firm's practices. Coordinated public records requests that overwhelmed a department's capacity to hide documents. Each act was designed to be reversible and to avoid physical harm. He avoided anything that would endanger lives or critical infrastructure. The goal was to increase the friction of centralized extraction, to make opacity expensive and slow. Parallel to disruption, he invested in building alternatives. He worked with community leaders to expand local food cooperatives, to set up neighborhood water purification systems, and to create barter networks that reduced dependence on centralized supply chains. He used his legal skills to craft bylaws that protected communal property and to defend nascent cooperatives from predatory contracts. The idea was to create islands of sufficiency that could sustain people if centralized systems faltered or were deliberately made less reliable for extractive actors. The cultural campaign was the hardest part. He knew that changing incentives required changing what people valued. He and a small group of allies, journalists, artists, community elders, began to craft narratives that celebrated sufficiency, mutual aid, and the dignity of small-scale life. They organized public events where neighbors shared skills, where elders taught traditional crafts, and where children learned to grow food in small plots. The messaging was careful. It did not romanticize poverty, but reframed dignity away from accumulation and toward care. The aim was to make the idea of a life measured by need rather than by possession plausible and desirable. As the campaign expanded, the state's response hardened. Surveillance intensified. Allies were questioned. A whistleblower who had provided key documents was arrested on dubious charges and held for days. The security apparatus began to use the language of national interest and stability to justify measures that had once been framed as administrative. He read the minds of the men who orchestrated these moves and felt the cold logic of containment. Neutralize the node, discredit the network, and reassert the narrative that dissent equaled disorder. The pressure forced him into riskier maneuvers. He began to use blackmail more often, but always with a structure. The target would be offered a choice that preserved dignity while producing accountability: resign and testify, return illicit gains, and fund community programs, or face public exposure that would trigger legal consequences. He avoided personal humiliation and sought outcomes that reallocated resources to the public good. The calculus was brutal and imperfect. He justified it as triage. When institutions weaponize secrecy, leverage becomes a tool of defense. The personal cost mounted. Friends drifted away, fearing association. Mara, who had once been his anchor, grew distant. She could not reconcile the man who had once used his gift to coax truth in court with the operator who now orchestrated leaks and coercion. Their conversations became careful negotiations about ethics and ends. She did not condemn him outright. She asked whether the world he sought to create would tolerate the methods he used to get there. Her private thoughts, fear, sorrow, a plea for restraint, cut deeper than any public accusation. He felt the strain in his own mind. Reading others had always been a burden. Now it was a weapon that could reshape societies. He began to dream of a world where the skill he had been born with would be unnecessary because people trusted one another and lived with sufficiency. The dream sustained him, but it also made him ruthless in pursuit of a horizon that might never arrive. He kept writing rules in his notebook, trying to anchor himself. Minimize harm, prioritize repair, protect the vulnerable, and never let the ends justify cruelty. The campaign reached a turning point when a coordinated leak exposed a network of contracts that tied municipal procurement to a handful of firms with political ties. The revelation triggered hearings, arrests, and a public outcry that forced immediate reforms. For a moment, it felt like vindication. The law, armed with evidence and public pressure, could still do transformative work. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The state's security apparatus responded by tightening legal definitions of national interest, expanding surveillance powers, and passing emergency measures that made whistleblowing riskier. The city's political center recoiled, and the public's appetite for radical change cooled under the weight of fear. He watched the city shift under the pressure of his own making. Neighborhoods that had embraced mutual aid now faced raids and audits. Workers who had benefited from exposed contracts found themselves unemployed as firms collapsed. The ledger of consequences grew heavier. He had wanted to reduce the scale of centralized power. Instead, he had provoked a backlash that consolidated it in new forms. The moral clarity that had once guided him blurred into a fog of unintended harms. On a rainless night, standing on the clinic's roof with the city spread below like a map of small lights, he felt the full weight of what he had set in motion. The campaign had protected many and harmed some. It had exposed corruption and provoked a security response that threatened civil liberties. He pressed his palm to his notebook and wrote a line that felt like both confession and command. If you break the machine, you must build the village. Do not leave people to the cold you create. The sentence was a vow and a warning, and the city answered with the private thoughts of a populace that had been stirred, frightened, and in some places newly hopeful. The turning point had arrived. The campaign would not simply be a series of exposures and legal victories. It had become a test of whether a single person, armed with an uncanny gift and a fierce moral imagination, could steer a society toward a different set of values without becoming the very force of domination he opposed. The next phase would demand new alliances, harder choices, and a reckoning with the limits of leverage. He closed his notebook and looked at the lights, knowing that the world he sought to remake would not yield without cost, and that the cost might be more than he had ever intended to pay. The spiral. The campaign's momentum carried him farther than he had intended. What began as a defense for a single clinic had become a project that touched procurement offices, campaign coffers, and the quiet corridors where decisions were made in the name of efficiency. Each revelation produced a ripple: resignations, audits, a few indictments. Citizens who had once felt powerless found a vocabulary for outrage. For a while, the work felt like repair. But the state's response hardened in ways that made the old tactics insufficient. The men in plain clothes no longer arrived as curious interrogators. They arrived as instruments of containment. Their thoughts were not merely about invoices and promotions. They contained references to operations, to dossiers, to the ways the apparatus of security could be used to silence inconvenient actors. When he read them, he felt the architecture of a power that did not merely bend facts but could manufacture them, bury them, and, if necessary, erase the people who stood in its way. The realization changed the scale of his ambition. If municipal corruption could be exposed and corrected by public pressure and legal process, the security apparatus operated on a different logic: secrecy, plausible deniability, and the capacity to reframe dissent as disorder. To confront that logic required more than leaks and hearings. It required a different kind of pressure, one that could make opacity costly, and that could create resilient alternatives to centralized control. The thought arrived like a cold wind. To protect the vulnerable at scale, he would have to alter the incentives that made centralized power seductive. He began to think in networks rather than cases. The clinics, the apprentices, the journalists, the clerks who had slipped him documents, they were nodes in a system that could be made resilient. He formalized channels for whistleblowers, created secure ways to transmit evidence, and built legal shields that could protect those who risked exposure. He trained allies in operational security: how to avoid surveillance, how to compartmentalize knowledge, how to use analog methods when digital traces were dangerous. The work was less glamorous than the headlines. It was the slow, patient labor of building redundancy. At the same time, his private methods grew bolder. He had always avoided direct coercion, but the presence of a security apparatus that could weaponize the law against vulnerable people changed the calculus. He began to use leverage more aggressively, not to humiliate individuals, but to force institutional concessions. A procurement director who refused to cooperate found his private tax irregularities quietly exposed to a journalist who understood the ethics of reporting. A contractor who had profited from collusion saw key bids rescinded when documents revealed a pattern of favoritism. He structured these exposures to produce public hearings and legal consequences rather than personal ruin. Resignations with admissions, restitution agreements, and public apologies that rewired incentives. The moral cost was real. He watched as employees of exposed firms lost jobs, as families felt the ripple effects of scandal, and as whistleblowers endured threats. He tried to mitigate harm by offering legal aid, relocation assistance, and psychological support. He insisted that every exposure be accompanied by a plan for repair, community funds to replace lost wages, retraining programs, and public forums where affected workers could be heard. The ledger in his notebook grew heavy with caveats and contingencies. He wrote rules for himself and for his allies: minimize collateral damage, prioritize systemic change, protect the vulnerable who might be harmed by exposure. Even so, the campaign's logic began to shift in ways that unsettled him. The more he dismantled the visible architecture of corruption, the more he encountered the deeper, cultural forces that sustained it. A society that prized accumulation, a political economy that rewarded spectacle, and a public discourse that equated order with centralized control. He read the private thoughts of officials who defended the status quo not out of greed, but out of fear. Fear that rapid change would produce chaos, that markets would collapse, that services would fail. Those fears were not irrational. They were the practical anxieties of people who had to manage complex systems. The realization complicated his moral clarity. It was in that complicated space that the idea of a more radical horizon took root. He began to imagine not merely reform, but a reorientation of values. A world where accumulation was limited, where property was scaled to need, where trust and mutual aid replaced the currency of contracts and litigation. The vision was not a nostalgic fantasy of returning to caves and fires. It was a political program that sought to reduce the scale of centralized power by shrinking the incentives that fed it. If procurement rents and concentrated wealth were the fuel for institutional capture, then reducing those rents would make capture harder. The plan that emerged from this vision was audacious and dangerous. It combined three strands: disruption of centralized infrastructures that enabled extraction, creation of decentralized networks that could meet basic needs, and a cultural campaign to revalue sufficiency over accumulation. Practically, it meant sabotaging the mechanisms that allowed large-scale profiteering, not by violence, but by making them unreliable and costly, while simultaneously building resilient local systems for food, water, and mutual aid. The aim was to make the city less hospitable to the kinds of centralized control that had enabled the abuses he had fought. He began to test the edges of this strategy. Small acts of sabotage were surgical. A procurement database corrupted with innocuous but time-consuming errors that forced audits and slowed corrupt contracts. A pattern of anonymous complaints that triggered oversight into a firm's practices. coordinated public records requests that overwhelmed a department's capacity to hide documents. Each act was designed to be reversible and to avoid physical harm. He avoided anything that would endanger lives or critical infrastructure. The goal was to increase the friction of centralized extraction, to make opacity expensive and slow. Parallel to disruption, he invested in building alternatives. He worked with community leaders to expand local food cooperatives, to set up neighborhood water purification systems, and to create barter networks that reduced dependence on centralized supply chains. He used his legal skills to craft bylaws that protected communal property and to defend nascent cooperatives from predatory contracts. The idea was to create islands of sufficiency that could sustain people if centralized systems faltered or were deliberately made less reliable for extractive actors. The cultural campaign was the hardest part. He knew that changing incentives required changing what people valued. He and a small group of allies, journalists, artists, community elders, began to craft narratives that celebrated sufficiency, mutual aid, and the dignity of small-scale life. They organized public events where neighbors shared skills, where elders taught traditional crafts, and where children learned to grow food in small plots. The messaging was careful. It did not romanticize poverty, but reframed dignity away from accumulation and toward care. The aim was to make the idea of a life measured by need rather than by possession plausible and desirable. As the campaign expanded, the state's response hardened. Surveillance intensified. Allies were questioned. A whistleblower who had provided key documents was arrested on dubious charges and held for days. The security apparatus began to use the language of national interest and stability to justify measures that had once been framed as administrative. He read the minds of the men who orchestrated these moves and felt the cold logic of containment. Neutralize the node, discredit the network, and reassert the narrative that dissent equaled disorder. The pressure forced him into riskier maneuvers. He began to use blackmail more often, but always with a structure. The target would be offered a choice that preserved dignity while producing accountability: resign and testify, return illicit gains, and fund community programs, or face public exposure that would trigger legal consequences. He avoided personal humiliation and sought outcomes that reallocated resources to the public good. The calculus was brutal and imperfect. He justified it as triage. When institutions weaponize secrecy, leverage becomes a tool of defense. The personal cost mounted. Friends drifted away, fearing association. Mara, who had once been his anchor, grew distant. She could not reconcile the man who had once used his gift to coax truth in court with the operator who now orchestrated leaks and coercion. Their conversations became careful negotiations about ethics and ends. She did not condemn him outright. She asked whether the world he sought to create would tolerate the methods he used to get there. Her private thoughts, fear, sorrow, a plea for restraint, cut deeper than any public accusation. He felt the strain in his own mind. Reading others had always been a burden. Now it was a weapon that could reshape societies. He began to dream of a world where the skill he had been born with would be unnecessary because people trusted one another and lived with sufficiency. The dream sustained him, but it also made him ruthless in pursuit of a horizon that might never arrive. He kept writing rules in his notebook, trying to anchor himself. Minimize harm, prioritize repair, protect the vulnerable, and never let the ends justify cruelty. The campaign reached a turning point when a coordinated leak exposed a network of contracts that tied municipal procurement to a handful of firms with political ties. The revelation triggered hearings, arrests, and a public outcry that forced immediate reforms. For a moment, it felt like vindication. The law, armed with evidence and public pressure, could still do transformative work. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The state's security apparatus responded by tightening legal definitions of national interest, expanding surveillance powers, and passing emergency measures that made whistleblowing riskier. The city's political center recoiled, and the public's appetite for radical change cooled under the weight of fear. He watched the city shift under the pressure of his own making. Neighborhoods that had embraced mutual aid now faced raids and audits. Workers who had benefited from exposed contracts found themselves unemployed as firms collapsed. The ledger of consequences grew heavier. He had wanted to reduce the scale of centralized power. Instead, he had provoked a backlash that consolidated it in new forms. The moral clarity that had once guided him blurred into a fog of unintended harms. On a rainless night, standing on the clinic's roof with the city spread below like a map of small lights, he felt the full weight of what he had set in motion. The campaign had protected many and harmed some. It had exposed corruption and provoked a security response that threatened civil liberties. He pressed his palm to his notebook and wrote a line that felt like both confession and command. If you break the machine, you must build the village. Do not leave people to the cold you create. The sentence was a vow and a warning, and the city answered with the private thoughts of a populace that had been stirred, frightened, and in some places newly hopeful. The turning point demanded a new strategy. He could not simply continue to pull threads and watch the fabric of civic life fray. If the state would respond by consolidating power, then the only durable path forward was to make the alternative irresistible and resilient. He doubled down on building local infrastructures, community-run clinics that could operate without municipal contracts, cooperative bakeries that shared ovens and profits, neighborhood energy projects that reduced dependence on centralized grids. He used legal instruments to protect communal assets and to create legal forms that made it harder for predatory firms to seize control. At the same time, he widened the scope of his operations. The security apparatus had shown him that the problem was not merely local. The same logics of extraction and secrecy operated at regional and national scales. He began to map networks beyond the city, procurement chains that crossed borders, shell companies that funneled money through offshore accounts, intelligence-sharing agreements that insulated officials from accountability. The map made the problem global in scale, and therefore required a bolder response. He recruited a new set of allies, hackers who could anonymize communications and create secure channels for whistleblowers, anthropologists who could help design culturally resonant narratives for the cultural campaign, logisticians who could advise on decentralized food and water systems, and a handful of former intelligence analysts who had grown disillusioned with the ways their skills were used. Each ally brought expertise and risk. He vetted them not by credentials alone, but by the private patterns of thought he could sense. Whether they feared harm, whether they sought glory, whether they could hold secrets without being consumed by them. The first operations beyond the city were surgical and symbolic. He exposed a regional procurement ring that supplied equipment to multiple municipalities, revealing how a handful of firms had captured entire sectors. He used the revelations to push for legal reforms that required open bidding and community oversight. He supported the creation of regional cooperatives that could bid collectively, reducing the leverage of large contractors. The victories were partial but meaningful. Contracts that once flowed predictably to the same firms now faced scrutiny, and communities gained new bargaining power. Yet the deeper architecture of state secrecy remained. He read the minds of intelligence officers and found a culture that prized control and narrative coherence. They thought in dossiers and contingencies, in the language of threats and stability. When he probed their private calculations, he found rationales that were chillingly pragmatic. The belief that some truths must be contained for the greater good, that certain actors must be neutralized to prevent chaos. The logic made it harder to argue with facts alone. It required a different kind of pressure, one that could make secrecy itself politically costly. He began to experiment with a new tactic: selective revelation. Instead of exposing everything at once, he curated disclosures that told a story, a narrative arc that connected procurement corruption to the erosion of public services, that linked secrecy to the erosion of trust, that showed how centralized accumulation produced social fragility. He worked with journalists to craft pieces that were not sensational but explanatory, that used documents and oral histories to make the case that opacity had real human costs. The aim was to shift public sentiment, to make transparency not merely a legal demand but a moral imperative. The tactic had mixed results. In some places, it galvanized reform. In others, it provoked a backlash that framed the disclosures as destabilizing. The security apparatus adapted, using emergency rhetoric to justify new powers. He watched as the political center hardened, as fear became a tool for consolidating authority. The ledger in his notebook filled with new rules. Escalate only when the public can absorb the revelation. Always pair exposure with repair. Never expose without a plan to protect those who might be endangered. The campaign's moral center wavered. He had started as a lawyer who defended the misrepresented, who used his gift to find facts and to protect the vulnerable. Now he orchestrated operations that reshaped economies and risked lives. He tried to hold both truths, that institutions must be held accountable, and that the methods of accountability must not become instruments of domination. The tension was unbearable at times. He found himself awake at odd hours, listening to the city's private chorus and wondering whether he had become the kind of actor he had once opposed. In the quiet of those nights, he returned to the small rituals that had kept him human: a walk at dawn, a cup of coffee made with the care his father had taught him, a ledger entry that began with confession. He met with allies and insisted on ethical reviews of proposed operations. He demanded that every plan include a repair strategy and a mechanism for community oversight. He tried to build a movement that could translate revelations into durable institutions, rather than into cycles of scandal and repression. And yet the spiral continued. Each success produced new enemies and new forms of containment. Each exposure forced the state to adapt. The campaign had become a contest of wills between a network that sought to decentralize power and an apparatus that sought to preserve it. The stakes were no longer merely municipal, they were structural. He had moved from defending a clinic to challenging the logic of accumulation itself. On a late autumn evening, after a day of hearings and a night of clandestine meetings, he stood on the clinic's roof and looked at the city's lights. The network hummed below, cooperatives, clinics, archives, and the small, stubborn practices that had grown from his first, halting acts of exposure. He pressed his palm to his notebook and wrote a line that felt like both a command and a prayer. Build the village while you break the machine. Keep the ledger open. Protect the people who make the work possible. The line was a vow and a warning. The spiral had no easy end. He had chosen a path that would demand sacrifices, that would test the limits of his ethics, and that would force him to confront the possibility that the means might one day eclipse the ends. The next phase would require new alliances, harder choices, and a reckoning with the limits of leverage. He closed the notebook and walked down into the city, knowing that the work he had begun would not be contained by any single life, and that the world he sought to make would ask more of him than he had yet imagined. The network tightens. The campaign had become a machine of small violences and careful repairs, a choreography of leaks and legal motions, of community kitchens and clandestine meetings. He moved through it like someone who had learned to read the weather, the way a council's mood shifted before a vote, the way a procurement office's inbox emptied on Fridays, the way a security team's attention narrowed when a journalist asked the wrong question. Each success widened the circle of people who believed in the project. Each success also widened the circle of those who wanted to stop it. The city, once a backdrop for his work, had become a contested terrain. He formalized the network in ways that made it more resilient. The clinics and cooperatives were nodes in a distributed architecture. The journalists and archivists were its public face. The clerks and analysts who fed him documents were its inside eyes. He created protocols for compartmentalization. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. Evidence was routed through secure channels, and whistleblowers were given legal and logistical support before any disclosure. He taught allies how to think like a system, how to create redundancy so that the loss of one node would not collapse the whole, how to seed documents in multiple hands so that no single arrest could silence a story, how to build public narratives that could not be easily dismissed as partisan noise. Operational security became a discipline. He and a small team of trusted technicians built analog fallbacks, paper caches hidden in safe houses, hand-delivered notes, and physical ledgers that could be read without leaving a digital trace. They used encrypted channels when necessary, but they also trained people to use low-tech methods that were harder for state actors to surveil at scale. He taught activists to rotate meeting locations, to use innocuous cover activities, and to cultivate plausible deniability. The lessons were practical and grim. The state's reach was long, and the only way to survive was to make the network porous and unpredictable. At the same time, he deepened the cultural work. The public events that had once been quaint, seed exchanges, repair fairs, communal meals, became deliberate acts of civic pedagogy. They taught neighbors how to share tools, how to organize mutual aid, and how to value sufficiency. Artists were commissioned to create murals that told stories of collective care rather than individual accumulation. Radio programs featured elders who spoke about reciprocity and the dignity of small-scale life. The messaging was subtle. It did not preach revolution. It taught practices that made people less dependent on centralized systems and more capable of sustaining one another. The network's legal arm continued to do the heavy lifting. Every leak was followed by a legal strategy, public records requests, motions for hearings, and the careful use of litigation to force transparency. He trained a cadre of lawyers who could move quickly, who understood how to translate documents into courtroom narratives, and who could protect whistleblowers from retaliatory suits. The law remained a public instrument, and he insisted that the network use it as much as possible. When secrecy was necessary, it was justified only by the need to protect lives or to preserve the possibility of public accountability. But the state's countermeasures grew more sophisticated. New laws expanded surveillance powers under the rubric of national resilience. Emergency protocols allowed for rapid seizure of data in the name of public safety. The security apparatus began to use disinformation as a tactic. Anonymous posts that smeared activists, fabricated memos that suggested the network was funded by foreign interests, and staged leaks that aimed to discredit genuine whistleblowers. The public conversation grew noisier and more polarized. The center that had once recoiled at corruption now feared instability more than opacity. He responded by sharpening the network's narrative discipline. Every disclosure was accompanied by context, oral histories from affected communities, data visualizations that showed the human cost of procurement capture, and legal briefs that explained the mechanisms of harm. He worked with journalists to produce long-form pieces that could not be easily dismissed as partisan spin. The aim was to make the revelations legible to a broader public, to turn scandal into reform rather than into spectacle. It was painstaking work, and it required allies who could translate technical evidence into stories that moved people. The moral calculus of his methods continued to gnaw at him. He had always tried to avoid harming innocents, but the campaign's logic sometimes produced collateral damage. When a contractor's corruption was exposed, its employees, many of them low-paid and precarious, lost work. When a procurement director resigned under pressure, his family felt the shock. He tried to mitigate these harms by creating funds to support displaced workers, by negotiating restitution agreements that prioritized community benefit, and by offering retraining programs. He insisted that every operation include a plan for repair. Still, the ledger of consequences grew heavy, and he found himself writing rules in his notebook with a hand that trembled. Do not let righteous ends justify cruelty. Always plan for those who will be harmed by exposure. Personal relationships frayed in ways that were both predictable and painful. Mara's distance widened into a quiet estrangement. She had been his anchor in the early days, the person who could hold his contradictions without being consumed by them. But the work had changed him. Where once he had coaxed truth in courtrooms, now he orchestrated leaks and leveraged secrets. Mara could not reconcile the lawyer who defended the misrepresented with the operator who used blackmail as a tool of policy. Their conversations became negotiations about ethics and limits. She asked him again and again whether the world he sought to create would tolerate the methods he used to get there. Her private thoughts, fear, sorrow, a plea for restraint, were a constant ache. He felt the loss of intimacy as a moral cost. The ability to read minds had always made intimacy complicated. Now it made it dangerous. He could sense Mara's private calculations when she considered leaving. The fear of being implicated, the worry about the safety of friends, the sadness at watching someone she loved become more willing to wield power. He tried to reassure her with plans and protocols, with promises of restraint and repair, but the distance remained. He learned to accept that some sacrifices were inevitable in the work he had chosen, and that the people he loved might not be willing to pay them. New allies arrived, some from unexpected places. A former intelligence analyst, disillusioned by the ways his skills had been used, offered expertise in counter-surveillance and in reading the patterns of state operations. A group of anthropologists helped refine the cultural campaign, advising on how to make sufficiency resonate across different neighborhoods and histories. A network of regional lawyers coordinated cross-jurisdictional strategies that made it harder for the state to isolate a single node. Each ally brought competence and risk. He vetted them not only by credentials, but by the private patterns of thought he could sense. Whether they feared harm, whether they sought glory, whether they could hold secrets without being consumed by them. The network's operations grew bolder. They targeted not only procurement rings, but the financial instruments that enabled them: shell companies, opaque bidding processes, and offshore conduits. He worked with forensic accountants to trace flows of money and with journalists to publish narratives that connected abstract financial maneuvers to the lived experiences of families who lost services. They exposed how a chain of contracts had siphoned funds from school repairs into luxury developments, how a privatized sanitation contract had left neighborhoods without basic services. Each revelation produced outrage and, sometimes, reform, but each also provoked a counterattack. The state's response became more direct. A trusted clerk who had provided documents was arrested on charges that seemed contrived. A journalist who had published a major piece found her bank accounts frozen pending an investigation. A cooperative that had been building a local water system faced sudden regulatory hurdles. The security apparatus used legal tools to punish and to deter. He read the minds of the men who orchestrated these moves and felt the cold logic of containment. Neutralize the node, discredit the network, and reassert the narrative that dissent equaled disorder. Faced with this, he made a choice that would mark a new phase of the campaign. He would not retreat into secrecy. He would escalate the construction of alternatives. If the state could weaponize law and surveillance, then the network would build parallel infrastructures that could sustain life without relying on centralized systems. They accelerated the rollout of neighborhood energy projects, expanded cooperative food distribution, and created legal forms that protected communal assets from predatory seizure. They trained local leaders in governance and in the legal tools necessary to defend communal property. The aim was not to overthrow the state by force, but to make centralized extraction less effective by reducing dependence on it. The strategy had a moral logic: reduce the stakes of centralized power by shrinking the resources it could capture. If people could meet their basic needs through mutual aid and local production, then the incentives for corruption would diminish. The vision was radical in its modesty, not a utopia of abundance, but a politics of sufficiency. It required patient work, the slow building of trust and capacity, and the willingness to accept incremental gains rather than dramatic victories. As the network tightened, the city changed in small, stubborn ways. A neighborhood that had once relied on a single contractor for water repairs now had a cooperative that could fix leaks within hours. A school that had been promised a new roof finally received one, after a public hearing forced the municipality to reallocate funds. People who had once felt powerless began to convene their own meetings, to demand transparency, and to refuse the logic that equated efficiency with secrecy. The changes were uneven and fragile, but they were real. On a cold night, after a day of hearings and a clandestine meeting with a whistleblower who had risked everything to hand over a cache of documents, he sat alone in his office and pressed his palm to the notebook where he had written his rules. The ink had bled in places from rain and from the tremor of his hand. He read the lines he had written over the years: protect the vulnerable, minimize harm, build alternatives, keep the ledger open. The words felt both like a map and a confession. He had moved from defending a single client to challenging the logic of accumulation itself. The work had become a test of whether a person with an uncanny gift could steer a society toward a different ethic without becoming the very force of domination he opposed. He closed the notebook and looked at the city through the window. The lights were a constellation of small lives, each with its private chorus. He could hear them all in a way that no one else could. The clerk's worry about a sick child, the contractor's private fear of ruin, the elder's quiet hope that the next generation would learn to share. The network hummed below, a fragile architecture of care and resistance. He felt the weight of what he had set in motion and the thinness of the line he walked. The next phase would demand more than tactics. It would demand a moral imagination capable of holding both the need to dismantle and the duty to rebuild. The reckoning. The city had become a palimpsest of his interventions. Layers of documents, hearings, cooperative bylaws, and murals that told a different story about what a neighborhood could be. Yet beneath the visible changes, there was a deeper current, one that moved in silence and in the private calculations of men and women who believed themselves to be the guardians of order. He had learned to read those currents as surely as he read a ledger. Now they were converging on him with a force that felt inevitable. The first sign of the new phase arrived in the form of a quiet, bureaucratic letter. It was not a summons or a subpoena, but a notice of review from a national oversight body. The kind of agency that existed to reassure the public that someone, somewhere, was watching the watchers. The letter's language was bland and procedural, but the thought echo behind it was sharp, an intention to map his network, to catalog its nodes, and to determine whether its activities constituted a threat to national stability. He read the minds of the officials who had signed the notice and felt the cold arithmetic of containment. If a movement could be framed as a security risk, then extraordinary powers could be justified. He convened the network's inner circle in a basement room whose windows had been painted over years before. The air smelled of coffee and paper. The walls were lined with maps and ledger pages. Allies arrived in pairs, in the practiced way of people who had learned to travel with redundancy. The former intelligence analyst sat at the head of the table, his face drawn but steady. The anthropologists had brought notes on cultural framing. The hackers had arrived with a stack of encrypted drives and a list of vulnerabilities they had found in municipal systems. They spoke in the language of contingency: what to do if a node was compromised, how to rotate keys, how to move caches of documents without leaving a trail. He listened and then spoke. He did not reveal everything he had heard in the minds of the officials. He never did. But he described the pattern: a national review that could be used to delegitimize the network, a legal apparatus that could freeze assets and criminalize coordination, and a public relations campaign that could paint their work as foreign-funded subversion. The room tightened. They had expected pushback. They had not expected the state to marshal its instruments so quickly. The response required a new kind of strategy. The network could no longer rely solely on leaks and legal pressure. It had to become resilient to legal and political assault. They accelerated the decentralization of resources. Cooperatives were reorganized into federations with legal personhood that made it harder to seize assets. Funds were distributed into community trusts with rotating trustees drawn from multiple neighborhoods. The hackers built air-gapped archives, physical caches of documents stored in safe houses and mirrored across jurisdictions. The legal team drafted emergency motions and prepared constitutional challenges to any overbroad use of national security rhetoric. At the same time, he felt the pressure to escalate in ways that made him uneasy. The National Review suggested that the state was not merely defensive, it was preparing to act. He read the private thoughts of the men who would carry out those actions and found a mixture of professional duty and personal ambition. Some saw the network as a threat to careers. Others saw it as a test of their capacity to maintain order. The mixture made them dangerous because it made their motives both bureaucratic and human. He began to probe the security apparatus more directly. Where before he had skirted the edges of intelligence work, now he sought to understand its inner logic. He read the minds of low-level operatives who had been tasked with compiling dossiers and found a culture of compartmentalization. Each person knew a sliver of a story and believed that the whole was too dangerous to hold. He listened to analysts who rationalized secrecy as a necessary evil, and to field officers who believed that the ends, stability, continuity, the prevention of chaos, justified the means. The more he listened, the more he saw the architecture of a system that could be turned if one knew where to press. The knowledge changed his tactics. He began to cultivate not only clerks and procurement assistants, but also disaffected operatives within the security apparatus. These were people who had seen the machinery at work and had been unsettled by what they had witnessed. Dossiers that were padded to justify surveillance, operations that targeted civic organizers rather than violent actors, and a culture that rewarded plausible deniability. He approached them with the same care he had shown to clerks and procurement assistants. Offers of legal protection, assurances of anonymity, and a moral argument that appealed to their better instincts. Some refused, others, quietly and with fear, agreed to help. The operatives' contributions were small at first, a redacted memo here, a list of internal codes there, but they were enough to reveal patterns. He learned how dossiers were assembled, how narratives were constructed, and how the apparatus used administrative tools to create legal cover for actions that would otherwise be indefensible. The pattern was chilling. A system that could manufacture consent by shaping the information environment and then claim necessity when the public reacted. Armed with this knowledge, he escalated his campaign in a way that blurred the line between exposure and sabotage. He did not attack infrastructure in the sense of causing physical harm. He attacked the credibility of the apparatus. He leaked internal memos that showed how certain operations had been justified by dubious intelligence, released timelines that contradicted official narratives, and published annotated dossiers that revealed the gaps between what was claimed and what was known. The goal was to make secrecy itself suspect. If the public could see the seams of the state's narratives, then the rhetorical power of national security would be diminished. The effect was immediate and volatile. A televised hearing convened to investigate the leaks, and the security agency's director testified with a practiced calm that cracked under the weight of documents. Journalists who had once been cautious now pressed harder, and a public conversation erupted about the balance between security and accountability. For a moment, it felt like a victory. The apparatus had been forced into daylight, and the network's argument that secrecy could be abused to protect interests rather than to protect people gained traction. But the victory had costs. The state responded with legal instruments that were blunt and far-reaching. Emergency powers were invoked in the name of national stability. Surveillance warrants were issued with broader scopes, and a campaign of disinformation sought to paint the network as a destabilizing force funded by foreign adversaries. The public conversation polarized. Some citizens rallied to the network's defense. Others recoiled at the idea that leaks could threaten order. The security apparatus, feeling its authority challenged, doubled down on containment. The campaign's escalation also intensified the moral strain within the network. He had always tried to avoid harming innocents, but the new phase made collateral damage more likely. A whistleblower who had provided a cache of documents was arrested on charges that seemed engineered to intimidate others. A cooperative that had been building a local energy grid found its funding frozen after a regulatory review that cited national security concerns. The ledger of consequences grew heavier, and he felt the weight of each line. He tried to mitigate harm where he could. Legal teams mobilized to defend arrested allies. Emergency funds were distributed to cooperatives facing audits. Journalists were briefed on how to protect sources. He insisted on ethical reviews for every operation, demanding that the network weigh the potential benefits against the likely harms. But the calculus was brutal. The more he exposed, the more the state adapted. The more the state adapted, the more drastic the measures he considered. In the midst of the escalation, a new temptation emerged, one that he had long resisted, but that now seemed, in private, to offer a shortcut to the horizon he imagined. If the architecture of centralized power could be made brittle by reducing the incentives for accumulation, then perhaps a more direct intervention could accelerate the process. Targeted disruptions to financial flows, carefully orchestrated failures in procurement systems, and the exposure of offshore conduits that funneled wealth away from public goods. The idea was not to cause chaos for its own sake, but to make the machinery of extraction unreliable and costly. He tested the edges of this approach with surgical precision. A set of shell companies that had been used to launder procurement kickbacks was exposed in a coordinated release that included bank records, emails, and internal memos. The firm's contracts were voided, and a cascade of audits followed. The public outcry forced a parliamentary inquiry into procurement practices, and several high-profile resignations followed. The move was effective. It also produced collateral damage. Employees of the implicated firms lost jobs, and small subcontractors who had depended on the contracts found themselves without work. He had anticipated some of these harms and had arranged for emergency funds and retraining programs, but the human cost was real. The moral calculus tightened. He found himself returning again and again to the same question. Can one dismantle a system of extraction without inflicting disproportionate harm on those who are already vulnerable? The answer was never clean. He tried to structure interventions so that the benefits, restitution, legal reform, community funds, outweighed the harms, but the ledger of consequences never balanced neatly. Each victory carried a shadow. Personal costs accumulated as well. Mara's distance hardened into a decision to leave the city for a time, to work with a rural cooperative that had been spared the worst of the crackdown. She did not abandon him. She asked for space and for a promise that he would not let the campaign consume his humanity. He promised, and the promise felt both necessary and fragile. He continued to read her private thoughts when they spoke, not to manipulate, but to understand the fissures his work had created. And each glimpse of her fear and sorrow cut deeper than any public criticism. The network's internal discipline frayed at moments. Some allies, hardened by the struggle, advocated for more aggressive tactics, sabotage of critical procurement databases, targeted leaks designed to ruin reputations, and the use of blackmail as a routine instrument of policy. He resisted these calls with a stubbornness that bordered on fanaticism. He had seen how power corrupted even the best intentions. He had vowed not to become the kind of actor who used secrets to dominate. But the pressure was relentless. The security apparatus was not merely defensive, it was offensive, and its reach extended into the lives of ordinary people. One night, after a day of hearings and a clandestine meeting with a whistleblower who had risked everything to hand over a cache of documents, he sat alone in the clinic's dim office. The city outside was a lattice of lights, each one a private life. He pressed his palm to his notebook and wrote, in a hand that trembled with fatigue and resolve, "Do not let the means eclipse the ends. Build the village while you break the machine. Protect the people who make the work possible." The line felt like both a command and a prayer. He had moved from defending a single client to challenging the logic of accumulation itself. The campaign had become a test of whether a person with an uncanny gift could steer a society toward a different ethic without becoming the very force of domination he opposed. The next phase would demand more than tactics. It would demand a moral imagination capable of holding both the need to dismantle and the duty to rebuild. As dawn approached, he closed the notebook and walked to the window. The city's lights blurred into a soft horizon. He could feel the private thoughts of the waking world, a baker's worry about flour deliveries, a mother's calculation of school fees, a clerk's dread of an audit, and he understood with a clarity that was almost painful that the work ahead would require patience as much as pressure. The reckoning had begun. He would have to choose again and again which lines he would cross and which he would not. The ledger would keep score, and the city would remember. The threshold. The city had become a machine of mirrors. Every exposure reflected another secret. Every reform revealed another loophole. He had learned to move through those reflections with a kind of practiced indifference, to treat each revelation as a tool rather than a triumph. But there are moments when tools begin to feel like scaffolding for something larger, when the architecture you have been dismantling suggests an alternative architecture you cannot ignore. The threshold he crossed in those months was not a single decision, but a slow accretion of certainties and resentments, of evidence and exhaustion. It was the moment when the question, "How do we fix this?" hardened into, "What would it take to make this impossible?" The immediate catalyst was not dramatic. It was a hearing in a sterile chamber where a minister, pressed by journalists and by the weight of leaked documents, offered a performance of contrition that felt rehearsed. He watched the minister's private thoughts as the man spoke, the calculations about polling numbers, the worry about donors, the mental list of allies to call, and the performance collapsed into a ledger of self-preservation. The public saw a man apologizing. He saw a man calculating how to survive. The difference between the two images was the difference between reform and theater. He felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the system could absorb scandal and reconstitute itself. It could sacrifice a few heads, rewrite a few contracts, and continue to extract. That night he walked the riverbank alone. The city's lights a constellation of small economies and private anxieties. He listened to the chorus of thoughts. A vendor's worry about a bad harvest, a commuter's calculation of overtime, a bureaucrat's fear of being exposed, and the pattern that had been forming in his mind for months crystallized into a plan that was both terrifying and, in his private calculus, necessary. If the incentives that fed centralized power could not be reformed because the system could always adapt, then the only durable solution was to change the scale of what counted as power. Make accumulation costly, make opacity unreliable, and shrink the levers that allowed a few to bend the many. He did not imagine a world of chaos. He imagined a world of smaller scales, neighborhoods that could meet their own needs, local economies that prioritized sufficiency, and social norms that prized trust over title. He imagined people who measured success by the health of their relationships and the resilience of their commons rather than by the size of their holdings. The vision was radical in its modesty. It was not a utopia of abundance, but a politics of limits. Property scaled to need, markets constrained by communal governance, and institutions that were accountable because they were embedded in networks of mutual aid rather than in distant hierarchies. Turning that vision into action required a different set of tools than leaks and hearings. It required infrastructure work, legal creativity, cultural persuasion, and, crucially, the capacity to make centralized extraction unreliable. He began to sketch a program that combined three vectors: targeted disruption of the mechanisms that enabled large-scale extraction, legal and institutional scaffolding for decentralized alternatives, and a cultural campaign that reframed sufficiency as dignity. Each vector had its own risks and moral pitfalls. Each demanded a discipline he was not sure he could sustain. The first vector, disruption, was surgical and clandestine. He had already used leaks and legal pressure to force resignations and audits. Now he sought to make the systems themselves brittle. He and a small team of trusted technicians mapped procurement platforms, financial clearinghouses, and the digital conduits that allowed contracts to be awarded with minimal scrutiny. They identified choke points, databases that, if corrupted with innocuous but time-consuming errors, would force audits and slow down the flow of contracts. Automated scoring algorithms that, if fed with alternative data, would produce unpredictable results, and centralized registries that, if temporarily inaccessible, would force municipalities to rely on local knowledge rather than on opaque vendor lists. They tested these interventions carefully. A procurement algorithm that had been tuned to favor certain vendors was fed a set of counterfactual bids that highlighted local cooperatives' capacity to deliver at lower social cost. The algorithm's output shifted, and a municipal tender that had been a foregone conclusion opened to new bidders. In another case, a registry's indexing system was subtly altered so that a shell company's records required manual verification. The delay triggered a review that exposed a chain of kickbacks. Each intervention was designed to be reversible and to avoid physical harm. The aim was to increase friction, not to destroy infrastructure. The second vector, building alternatives, was the work of patient construction. He poured legal energy into creating new forms of communal ownership. Cooperative charters that made it difficult for predatory firms to capture assets, trust structures that distributed decision-making across neighborhoods, and procurement frameworks that prioritized local suppliers and social value. He used his courtroom skills to defend nascent cooperatives against predatory lawsuits and to craft bylaws that embedded transparency and rotation of leadership. He helped set up neighborhood energy projects that used modular, locally maintained systems rather than centralized grids. He supported water purification cooperatives that could be managed by local councils. He advised on seed banks and shared tool libraries. These alternatives were not utopian fantasies. They were pragmatic responses to the vulnerabilities he had exposed. They required training, seed funding, and legal protection. He organized workshops where elders taught traditional techniques, where technicians trained local maintenance crews, and where lawyers explained how to use bylaws to protect communal assets. The work was slow and often thankless, but it created islands of resilience that could sustain communities when centralized systems faltered or were deliberately made less reliable for extractive actors. The third vector, culture, was the hardest and the most delicate. He knew that institutions are sustained not only by laws and contracts, but by stories and values. He and a small cadre of artists, journalists, and community elders began to craft narratives that reframed sufficiency as dignity. They organized repair fairs, seed exchanges, and public rituals that celebrated mutual aid. They commissioned murals that depicted shared labor rather than solitary accumulation. Radio programs featured conversations about the ethics of possession and the history of commons. The messaging was careful. It did not romanticize scarcity, but argued that a life measured by need rather than by accumulation could be richer in trust and meaning. As the program unfolded, the state's countermeasures intensified. The national oversight body that had begun the review now coordinated with municipal security units. Surveillance increased in subtle and overt ways. More plainclothes officers at public events, sudden audits of cooperatives' finances, and legal maneuvers that froze bank accounts on the pretext of national security. The apparatus framed the network's activities as destabilizing, and the public conversation polarized. Some citizens embraced the idea of sufficiency and local resilience. Others feared the loss of services and the specter of disorder. He read the minds of the men and women who orchestrated the crackdown and found a mixture of motives: genuine fear of instability, careerism, and a bureaucratic logic that equated centralization with manageability. The mixture made them formidable because it made their actions both rational and human. He also read the private thoughts of ordinary people who watched the news and felt anxiety. A mother worried about school lunches, a small business owner fearful of losing contracts, an elder unsure whether the new cooperatives would survive. The campaign's moral calculus tightened. Every intervention that made centralized extraction harder also risked unsettling lives that depended on the existing order. To mitigate harm, he doubled down on repair strategies. When a contractor lost a bid because of exposed collusion, he worked to ensure that subcontractors were offered transitional support and retraining. When a cooperative faced a regulatory freeze, he mobilized legal defenses and emergency funds. He insisted that every disruption be paired with a plan for social protection. The ledger in his notebook grew dense with contingencies and caveats. Always plan for the displaced. Prioritize restitution. Do not weaponize scarcity. Yet the deeper temptation, the one that had been whispering at the edges of his resolve, grew louder. If making centralized extraction unreliable could be achieved through surgical disruptions and the building of alternatives, what would happen if the scale of modern life itself were reduced? What if the social and economic structures that made accumulation possible were deliberately shrunk so that the incentives for capture evaporated? The thought was radical and dangerous. To push society toward a form of primitivism where property was limited to what was necessary for life, where markets were local and small, and where trust and mutual aid were the primary currencies. He knew the history of such projects and their failures. He had read about revolutions that promised liberation and delivered coercion, about utopias that required policing, about experiments that collapsed into scarcity and suffering. He also knew the slow violence of the status quo, communities displaced by development, services privatized for profit, reputations destroyed by manufactured narratives. The moral calculus was brutal. Could he justify a program that would deliberately shrink the scale of modern life if it meant reducing the capacity for centralized harm? Could he accept the risk that such a program might itself become coercive? The threshold he faced was not merely strategic, but existential. To move from targeted disruption and institution building to a program that sought to reconfigure social scale would require a willingness to wield power in ways he had always resisted. It would require secrecy, coordination, and the capacity to shape public perception on a mass scale. It would also require a new kind of discipline, to ensure that the reduction of scale did not become an excuse for authoritarian control, that the aim of sufficiency did not become a pretext for deprivation. He convened a small, secret council to test the idea. The former intelligence analyst, the anthropologists, a few trusted lawyers, and a community elder who had seen cycles of extraction and resistance gathered in a room whose windows were shuttered. They debated the ethics and the logistics. The analyst warned of the risks. Once you begin to shape systems at scale, you risk unintended consequences and the temptation to centralize control in the name of efficiency. The anthropologists argued for humility. Any attempt to reconfigure values must be participatory and rooted in local practices. The elder spoke of history, how communities had survived by sharing and by limiting accumulation, but also how they had been vulnerable to external shocks. They did not reach a consensus. What emerged instead was a set of principles that would govern any move toward scale reduction. Consent where possible, transparency about aims where feasible, robust protections for the vulnerable, and an insistence that any coercive measures be temporary and reversible. The principles were fragile scaffolding for a project that would test the limits of his ethics. He left the meeting with a sense of both possibility and dread. The threshold had been crossed not by a single act, but by a series of choices that had accumulated into a new horizon. He had moved from defending the misrepresented to challenging the logic of accumulation itself. The work ahead would demand more than tactics. It would demand a moral imagination capable of holding both the need to dismantle and the duty to rebuild. He pressed his palm to his notebook and wrote, in a hand that trembled with resolve and fear. If you will shrink the world, do so to enlarge trust. Let sufficiency be a choice, not a sentence. Outside, the city hummed with private thoughts, a vendor's worry, a bureaucrat's calculation, a child's dream. He could hear them all as he always had, and the chorus felt heavier than ever. The threshold had been crossed. The next phase would test whether a single person, armed with an uncanny gift and a fierce moral imagination, could steer a society toward a different ethic without becoming the very force of domination he opposed. He closed the notebook and walked into the night, knowing that the choices to come would be measured not only in documents and hearings, but in the lives that would be remade by them. The implementation. He had crossed the threshold. The question now was how to make a vision that had been sketched in notebooks and whispered in basement meetings take shape in the messy, resistant world. The plan that had once lived as an ethical thought experiment now required logistics, timing, and a willingness to accept consequences he had only ever imagined in the abstract. Implementation meant moving from exposing corruption to reshaping the conditions that made corruption possible. It meant turning ideas about sufficiency and mutual aid into durable practices that could survive a state bent on containment. The first phase of implementation was deceptively simple. Make centralized extraction unreliable in ways that nudged people toward local alternatives without causing catastrophic harm. He and his inner circle designed interventions that were surgical rather than catastrophic. They targeted the administrative seams that allowed contracts to be awarded with minimal scrutiny, automated scoring systems, opaque vendor registries, and procurement portals that favored scale over social value. Technicians in the network introduced benign anomalies data that required manual verification, timestamps that flagged inconsistencies, algorithmic inputs that elevated local cooperatives, bids when social cost metrics were applied. The changes were subtle. They forced human review and opened opportunities for local suppliers to compete. He refused to publish technical manuals or to teach others how to replicate the exact manipulations. The ethics of the work demanded discretion. The goal was not to teach sabotage, but to create breathing room for alternatives. When a tender that had been a foregone conclusion opened to new bidders, local bakeries and small repair firms found themselves able to compete. Contracts that once flowed predictably to a handful of firms were now subject to scrutiny and community oversight. The ripple effects were immediate and, in many places, quietly beneficial. A school received a roof repair from a cooperative that hired local labor. A clinic obtained supplies from a neighborhood distributor who reinvested profits into community health programs. Parallel to these administrative interventions, the network accelerated the construction of alternatives. Legal teams finalized cooperative charters that embedded rotation of leadership, transparency clauses, and community vetoes. Neighborhood energy projects moved from pilot to scale. Modular microgrids were installed on rooftops and in courtyards, maintained by local crews trained in simple repairs. Water purification cooperatives, once a handful of experimental sites, expanded into a network that could treat and distribute potable water independently of municipal contracts. Seed banks and shared tool libraries proliferated, and the cultural campaign, repair fairs, seed exchanges, murals, became a steady rhythm rather than a novelty. The cultural work was as important as the technical. Artists and elders collaborated on public rituals that reframed sufficiency as dignity. Children learned to grow food in small plots. Elders taught the songs that had once explained the river's moods. Radio programs and long-form journalism told stories that connected procurement corruption to the lived experience of families who had lost services. The narrative shifted in neighborhoods where people saw tangible benefits, local jobs, faster repairs, and a sense of agency. For many, the new practices were not a sacrifice, but a reclamation of competence and care. Yet implementation also required harder choices. The state's security apparatus had not been idle. Emergency measures, expanded surveillance powers, and legal instruments designed to freeze assets were deployed with increasing frequency. The network's allies were targeted. A clerk who had leaked documents was arrested on charges that seemed engineered to intimidate. A journalist's bank accounts were frozen pending an investigation. A cooperative's funding was suspended under the pretext of regulatory compliance. The apparatus framed these moves as necessary for stability, and a portion of the public, frightened by the rhetoric of disorder, accepted the framing. Faced with this, he made decisions that would haunt him. He authorized operations that went beyond exposure and into coercive leverage. Targets were offered choices that preserved dignity but forced accountability. Resign and testify, return illicit gains and fund community programs, or face public exposure that would trigger legal consequences. He insisted on limits, no personal humiliation, no threats to families, no violence, but the use of leverage nonetheless left scars. Employees of implicated firms lost jobs. Small subcontractors who had depended on corrupt contracts found themselves suddenly without work. He tried to mitigate harm with emergency funds, retraining programs, and community restitution, but the ledger of consequences grew heavier. The moral calculus tightened when a coordinated disruption of a regional clearinghouse produced a cascade of delays that affected food distribution in outlying neighborhoods. The intervention had been designed to force manual verification of contracts and to open space for local suppliers. Instead, a confluence of bureaucratic inertia and opportunistic hoarding by private distributors led to temporary shortages in a few districts. The network mobilized immediately. Community kitchens extended hours, cooperatives rerouted supplies, and emergency funds were deployed to buy food from small farmers. The crisis passed without mass harm, but the episode left him shaken. He had always promised to avoid creating scarcity. Now he had come dangerously close. Mara's absence became a constant ache. She had left the city for a rural cooperative that offered distance and a different kind of work. Their last conversation had been careful and full of the things people say when love and ethics collide. She asked him to promise restraint. He promised, and the promise felt both necessary and fragile. She did not condemn him outright. She feared the man she loved was becoming someone who justified means by ends. Her departure was not a betrayal, but a boundary. He respected it and felt the loneliness it left behind. The network's internal discipline frayed at times. Some allies, hardened by the struggle, argued for more aggressive tactics, targeted leaks designed to ruin reputations, routine use of blackmail, and the sabotage of critical procurement databases. He resisted these calls with a stubbornness that bordered on fanaticism. He had seen how power corrupted even the best intentions. He had vowed not to become the kind of actor who used secrets to dominate. But the pressure was relentless. The security apparatus was not merely defensive, it was offensive, and its reach extended into the lives of ordinary people. To counter the state's legal maneuvers, the network invested in constitutional challenges and public education. Lawyers filed suits that tested the limits of emergency powers. Journalists produced long-form investigations that contextualized leaks rather than sensationalized them. Community leaders organized public hearings that demanded accountability. The legal battles were slow and costly, but they created precedents that made it harder for the state to use national security rhetoric as a blanket justification for repression. International attention complicated matters. Foreign media picked up the story of a city where cooperatives were reclaiming public goods and where a shadow campaign had exposed procurement corruption. Some outlets framed the movement as a hopeful experiment in decentralization. Others echoed the state's narrative of destabilization. The security apparatus used the latter to justify further measures. He read the private thoughts of foreign correspondents and diplomats and found a mix of curiosity, opportunism, and genuine concern. The global gaze made the stakes higher and the options narrower. Amid the external pressures, the network doubled down on care. They created a rotating pool of substitute staff to prevent burnout, established mental health funds for activists and whistleblowers, and formalized protocols for ethical review of operations. Every proposed intervention required a written plan for mitigation and repair. He insisted on transparency within the network. Minutes of ethical reviews were recorded, and decisions were debated in councils that included community elders. The rituals of accountability were imperfect but sincere. Still, the deeper temptation, the one that had been whispering at the edges of his resolve since the threshold, grew louder. If making centralized extraction unreliable could be achieved through surgical disruptions and the building of alternatives, what would happen if the scale of modern life itself were reduced more deliberately? What if markets were constrained, property limited to need, and trust elevated as the primary currency? The thought was radical and dangerous. It promised a world where the levers of centralized power were less effective, but it also risked coercion and deprivation if implemented without consent. He convened a secret council to test the idea. The former intelligence analyst warned of the risks. Once you begin to shape systems at scale, you risk unintended consequences and the temptation to centralize control in the name of efficiency. The anthropologists argued for humility. Any attempt to reconfigure values must be participatory and rooted in local practices. The elder spoke of history. Communities had survived by sharing and by limiting accumulation, but they had also been vulnerable to external shocks. They did not reach consensus. What emerged instead was a set of principles. Consent where possible, transparency about aims where feasible, robust protections for the vulnerable, and an insistence that coercive measures be temporary and reversible. The implementation phase had already changed the city in ways that were both hopeful and fraught. Neighborhoods that had once relied on a single contractor now had cooperatives that could fix leaks within hours. Schools that had been promised repairs finally received them after public hearings forced municipalities to reallocate funds. People who had once felt powerless began to convene their own meetings and to demand transparency. But the state's countermeasures had hardened. and the moral ledger had accumulated lines he could not erase. On a night when rain stitched the city's lights into a soft blur, he stood on a rooftop and pressed his palm to the notebook where he had written rules and confessions. The ink had bled in places from rain and from the tremor of his hand. He read the lines he had written over the years: protect the vulnerable, minimize harm, build alternatives, keep the ledger open. The words felt both like a map and a confession. Implementation had begun, and with it the work of repair and reckoning. The next phase would demand more than tactics. It would demand a moral imagination capable of holding both the need to dismantle and the duty to rebuild. He closed the notebook and walked down into the city, knowing that the choices ahead would be measured not only in documents and hearings, but in the lives that would be remade by them. The cost of control. The city had begun to feel like a living organism that reacted to pressure. When he tugged at one tendon, another tightened. When he exposed one rot, the body compensated in ways that were sometimes cruel and always clever. The network had grown teeth and a nervous system, but it had also developed scars. He had learned to read the private weather of people's minds and to move like a surgeon through institutions. Now he had to reckon with the fact that every incision left a wound, and every wound demanded care. The immediate aftermath of the regional procurement scandal left the municipal center raw. Committees convened, auditors were reassigned, and a handful of officials resigned with statements that read like apologies written by lawyers. The public felt vindicated for a moment. The press ran long pieces about civic courage and the power of evidence. Yet beneath the headlines, the security apparatus retooled. New protocols were drafted, oversight bodies were given broader mandates, and a culture of preemption took hold. Better to stop a rumor before it spread than to answer for a truth later. The state's reflex was not merely defensive, it was adaptive, and adaptation meant new forms of containment. He watched the shift with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. The reforms he had forced were real. Procurement rules were rewritten, community oversight boards were created, and several contracts were reissued to local cooperatives. But the state's countermeasures were also real, and they were efficient. Surveillance increased in ways that were subtle and bureaucratic. More audits, more background checks, more administrative reviews that could be used to freeze projects on technicalities. The network's cooperatives found themselves entangled in compliance demands that required legal teams and time they did not have. The very transparency he had fought for became a tool for delay. The moral ledger in his notebook grew heavier. He had always tried to pair exposure with repair, to ensure that when a firm lost a contract, the workers who depended on it would not be abandoned. But the scale of the backlash made mitigation harder. Emergency funds could patch a hole for a month. Retraining programs could take years to bear fruit. He found himself spending more time on social triage than on strategy, arranging stipends, negotiating temporary contracts, and convincing municipal partners to prioritize rehiring through community procurement clauses. The work was necessary and humbling, but it also felt like a bandage on a wound that required structural surgery. The personal costs were sharper. Mara's absence was a constant ache that did not dull with time. She had left to work with a rural cooperative, and their correspondence had become careful and infrequent. When they spoke, she asked him to remember the people who would be harmed by his choices and to keep the ledger of consequences in view. Her private thoughts, the ones he could not help but sense, were a mixture of sorrow and a steady, practical wisdom. Build slowly, protect the vulnerable, do not let righteous anger become a justification for harm. He tried to honor her counsel, but the campaign's momentum had its own gravity. The more the state pushed back, the more he felt compelled to escalate. The escalation took forms that were both strategic and intimate. He began to cultivate a different kind of ally, not only clerks and journalists, but technicians and mid-level operatives inside the security apparatus who were quietly disillusioned. These were people who had seen dossiers padded to justify surveillance, who had watched operations target civic organizers rather than violent actors, and who had begun to question the moral calculus of their work. He approached them with offers that were practical and humane: legal protection, anonymity, and a chance to redirect their skills toward building resilient alternatives rather than policing dissent. Some of these operatives were cautious and fearful, others were eager for a way out. The information they provided was invaluable. He learned how dossiers were assembled, how narratives were manufactured, and how administrative tools could be used to freeze projects without a public trial. With that knowledge, he could anticipate the state's moves and design interventions that preempted them. He could, for instance, ensure that a cooperative's legal paperwork was airtight before a regulatory review, or that a whistleblower's testimony was corroborated by multiple independent sources before an arrest could be used to discredit them. Yet the deeper he moved into the apparatus's inner logic, the more he felt the corrosive temptation of power. Knowledge of vulnerabilities is a kind of leverage. Leverage can be used to protect, but it can also be used to coerce. He had always tried to limit coercion to cases where imminent harm would otherwise occur, and he had structured his leverage to produce restitution and accountability rather than humiliation. But the line between pressure and domination thinned when the stakes were high and the state's instruments were blunt. A particular episode crystallized the danger. A mid-level intelligence officer who had been quietly feeding the network redacted memos and internal timelines was suddenly reassigned to a remote post. The reassignment was framed as routine. The officer's private thoughts, which he had read in passing, betrayed fear for his family and a sense of betrayal by the institution he had served. The network could have left the man to his fate. Instead, they arranged a legal challenge to the reassignment, mobilized public pressure through sympathetic journalists, and secured a transfer that kept him in the city, but out of the agency's direct chain of command. The rescue felt like a moral victory, but it also revealed the network's growing capacity to shape careers and lives, a capacity that demanded constant ethical scrutiny. The campaign's tactics evolved in response to the state's adaptation. Where leaks and legal pressure had once been sufficient, now they had to be combined with constructive alternatives that made the public less dependent on centralized systems. He poured energy into scaling cooperatives, into legal frameworks that protected communal assets, and into training programs that taught neighbors how to maintain microgrids and water systems. The aim was to make the city resilient in ways that did not rely on the goodwill of officials or the integrity of procurement processes. Those efforts bore fruit in pockets. A neighborhood that had once waited months for a contractor to fix a broken pump now had a cooperative crew that could repair it in hours. A school that had been promised a new roof received one from a local builder who had been trained and certified through a community program. These were small victories, but they mattered in the lives of families who no longer had to wait for distant bureaucracies to act. The cooperatives also created a new political constituency, people who had a stake in local governance and who could mobilize to defend communal assets. But the state's countermeasures continued to evolve. Emergency powers were invoked with increasing frequency. Regulatory reviews became a favored tool to slow or freeze projects, and disinformation campaigns sought to paint cooperatives as inefficient or foreign-funded. The public conversation polarized. Some citizens embraced the idea of sufficiency and local resilience. Others feared the loss of services and the specter of disorder. The security apparatus framed the network as a destabilizing force, and the political center, anxious about stability, sometimes sided with containment. He found himself increasingly in the role of mediator between two kinds of fear: the fear of centralized abuse and the fear of instability. He tried to craft messages that acknowledged both anxieties. He worked with journalists to produce long-form pieces that explained how procurement capture translated into broken schools and delayed repairs. He organized public forums where elders and technicians demonstrated how cooperatives worked. He insisted that every disruption be paired with a plan for social protection. The rhetorical work was as important as the technical work. People needed to see that alternatives were not a romantic retreat, but a practical way to secure daily life. The moral strain took a toll on the network's cohesion. Some allies, hardened by the struggle, argued for more aggressive measures. Routine use of leverage, targeted reputational attacks, and the occasional sabotage of administrative systems to force manual processes. He resisted these calls with a stubbornness that bordered on fanaticism. He had seen how power corrupted even the best intentions. He had vowed not to become the kind of actor who used secrets to dominate. But the pressure was relentless. The security apparatus was not merely defensive, it was offensive, and its reach extended into the lives of ordinary people. In private, he returned again and again to the ledger in his notebook. He wrote rules and confessions, trying to anchor himself in a moral grammar that could survive the campaign's temptations. Do not weaponize scarcity. Prioritize restitution. Protect the vulnerable. Build the village while you break the machine. The lines were both map and prayer. They reminded him that the work was not merely about dismantling power, but about creating conditions where people could live with dignity. A crisis forced a brutal test of those rules. A coordinated disruption of a regional clearinghouse designed to force manual verification of contracts and to open space for local suppliers produced an unexpected cascade. Bureaucratic inertia, opportunistic hoarding by private distributors, and a delayed municipal response led to temporary shortages in several outlying districts. The network mobilized emergency kitchens, rerouted supplies through cooperatives, and deployed funds to buy food from small farmers. The crisis passed without mass harm, but the episode left him shaken. He had promised to avoid creating scarcity. Now he had come dangerously close. The fallout sharpened internal debates. Some argued that the risk of occasional disruption was acceptable if it accelerated the decline of extractive systems. Others insisted that any harm to ordinary people was a moral failure. He convened a council of elders, lawyers, and community leaders to review the operation and to revise protocols. They tightened ethical review processes, required more robust contingency plans, and insisted that any future disruptions include prearranged social protections. The revisions were painful but necessary. They acknowledged that the campaign's moral authority depended on its capacity to protect those it claimed to serve. Outside the network, the political landscape shifted. A new minister, elected on a platform of stability and efficiency, campaigned against what he called reckless disruption. He promised to restore order and to protect jobs. The rhetoric resonated with voters who feared instability more than opacity. The minister's office used legal instruments to slow cooperative projects and to audit funding sources. The network's public support wavered in some quarters. He understood the political logic. People fear immediate loss more than abstract injustice. And he redoubled efforts to show tangible benefits. Faster repairs, local jobs, and community funds that replaced lost wages. The campaign's moral center remained contested. He had started as a lawyer who defended the misrepresented, who used his gift to find facts and to protect the vulnerable. Now he orchestrated operations that reshaped economies and risked lives. He tried to hold both truths, that institutions must be held accountable, and that the methods of accountability must not become instruments of domination. The tension was unbearable at times. He found himself awake at odd hours, listening to the city's private chorus and wondering whether he had become the kind of actor he had once opposed. In the quiet of those nights, he returned to small rituals that kept him human. A walk at dawn, a cup of coffee made with the care his father had taught him, a ledger entry that began with confession. He met with allies and insisted on ethical reviews of proposed operations. He demanded that every plan include a repair strategy and a mechanism for community oversight. He tried to build a movement that could translate revelations into durable institutions, rather than into cycles of scandal and repression. The cost of control was no longer an abstract idea. It was a ledger of names, of displaced workers, of cooperatives that had weathered audits, of whistleblowers who had paid a price. He had learned that power could be used to protect and to harm, and that the difference often lay in the small choices made in the margins. The campaign would continue because the alternatives were bleak and the injustices real. But he also knew that every escalation required a corresponding act of repair, and that the moral authority of the movement depended on its capacity to keep that promise. On a rain-slick night, standing on a rooftop and looking at the city's lights, he pressed his palm to the notebook and wrote a line that felt like both a vow and a plea. If you will reshape the world, do so to enlarge trust, not to concentrate power. Let sufficiency be a choice, not a sentence. The ink bled in the rain, but the words held. He closed the ledger and walked down into the city, knowing that the next choices would test not only his skill but his soul. The city had become a place of two simultaneous truths, the visible one of hearings, cooperatives, and municipal reforms, and the invisible one of dossiers, countermeasures, and the slow arithmetic of containment. He moved between those truths like a man who had learned to live with two hearts beating out of sync. Each victory left a residue of consequence. Each exposure invited a new form of repression. The ledger in his notebook had become a map of trade-offs, and the ink had begun to look like a record of small violences performed in the name of a larger good. The political center hardened. The minister who had campaigned on stability used the scandals as proof that the city needed stronger hands. Emergency measures were extended. Oversight bodies were reconstituted with officials whose first loyalty was to order. The security apparatus, having been publicly embarrassed, reorganized itself with a new mandate: anticipate dissent before it could cohere. Surveillance budgets increased, procurement systems were hardened, and legal thresholds for freezing assets were lowered. The state learned quickly how to turn transparency into a weapon. Audits, compliance checks, and regulatory reviews became tools to slow and to punish. He watched the shift with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. The reforms he had forced were real procurement rules rewritten, cooperatives legally recognized, community oversight boards established. But the state's response had created a new landscape of friction. Projects stalled under the weight of compliance. Small cooperatives found themselves entangled in audits that required legal teams they could not afford. The very openness he had demanded now became a bureaucratic snare. He had anticipated resistance. He had not anticipated how easily the language of accountability could be repurposed to suffocate the alternatives he had helped build. The network's internal discipline frayed under the pressure. Some allies argued for escalation, more aggressive leaks, targeted reputational attacks, even sabotage of administrative systems to force manual processes. Others insisted on restraint, on the slow work of building capacity and trust. The debates were fierce and sometimes bitter. He convened councils, insisted on ethical reviews, and tried to hold the line he had written in his notebook: minimize harm, prioritize repair, protect the vulnerable. But the line felt thinner with each passing month. Then came the moment that changed the tenor of everything: a coordinated arrest that targeted a cluster of the network's most exposed allies. The state moved with a speed and precision that suggested it had been waiting for the right moment. In the space of a single dawn, several activists, a procurement whistleblower, and a journalist who had published a major exposé were detained on charges ranging from fraud to endangering national security. The arrests were theatrical: televised statements, sealed warrants, and a narrative that framed the network as a destabilizing force with foreign ties. He read the minds of the men who orchestrated the operation and felt the cold logic of containment: neutralize the nodes, discredit the movement, and reassert the narrative that equated dissent with disorder. Their private thoughts were a mixture of professional pride and personal ambition. Some believed they were protecting the city, others that they were securing careers. The mixture made them dangerous because it made their actions both bureaucratically plausible and humanly ruthless. The arrests were a blow. The network scrambled to provide legal aid, to mobilize public pressure, and to protect other vulnerable members. The cooperatives that had relied on the detained organizers found themselves suddenly exposed to audits and to the risk of funding freezes. The public conversation polarized further. Some citizens, frightened by the rhetoric of instability, supported the state's actions. Others, outraged by the apparent overreach, rallied in defense of the detained. The city felt like a wound that had been reopened. In the quiet that followed, he sat with the ledger and felt the weight of responsibility in a way that was almost physical. The campaign had protected many, but it had also made enemies who were willing to use the full force of the state to stop it. He had always believed that the law, combined with public pressure, could correct institutional capture. Now he saw that the state could adapt, weaponize legal forms, and use the language of security to justify repression. The moral calculus he had been balancing for years now tilted toward a darker horizon. If the state would not yield to reform, perhaps the only durable path was to change the conditions that made centralized power so effective. The idea that had been whispering at the edges of his resolve, to shrink the scale of accumulation and to revalue sufficiency, hardened into a plan that was both practical and radical. He would not attempt to overthrow the state. He had no appetite for chaos. Instead, he would make the levers of centralized extraction unreliable and costly, and he would accelerate the construction of decentralized alternatives until dependence on centralized systems diminished. The aim was to create a social ecology in which the incentives for capture were reduced, because the resources to be captured were distributed, and because communities could meet their own needs. But the arrests had taught him a painful lesson. Transparency and legal pressure alone were insufficient when the state could redefine dissent as a security threat. The new plan required a different posture. It demanded deeper secrecy, more robust protections for allies, and a willingness to use leverage in ways he had previously avoided. It also demanded a moral framework that could justify the risks, consent where possible, repair where harm was likely, and an insistence that coercive measures be temporary and reversible. He began by hardening the network's protections. Secure caches of documents were mirrored across jurisdictions. Analog fallbacks were expanded. Legal teams prepared emergency motions that could be filed at a moment's notice. He recruited a new set of allies, former intelligence officers who had become disillusioned, technologists who could anonymize communications, and rural cooperatives that could host people and resources if urban pressure became unbearable. Each ally was vetted not only for skill, but for moral steadiness. He read their private thoughts as he always had, not to manipulate, but to sense whether they could hold secrets without being consumed by them. At the same time, he accelerated the construction of alternatives. Neighborhood microgrids were scaled up. Water purification cooperatives expanded their distribution networks. Seed banks and tool libraries proliferated. Legal forms were refined to protect communal assets from predatory seizure. Trusts with rotating trustees, bylaws that required community consent for major decisions, and procurement frameworks that prioritized social value. The work was painstaking and often invisible, but it created islands of resilience that could sustain people if centralized systems faltered or were weaponized. The cultural campaign intensified. Artists, elders, and teachers collaborated on curricula that taught practical skills and civic imagination. How to maintain a solar array, how to run a cooperative meeting, how to negotiate a community procurement clause. Public rituals celebrated repair and mutual aid. The aim was to make sufficiency not merely a policy preference but a lived practice, a set of habits that could survive political storms. Yet the moral tension never left him. The arrests had shown that the state would not hesitate to use legal instruments to crush dissent. He found himself authorizing operations that edged into coercive leverage, exposing dossiers that tied officials to corrupt networks, threatening public exposure to force resignations and restitution, and using the threat of disclosure to secure legal protections for whistleblowers. He insisted on limits: no personal humiliation, no threats to families, no violence, but the use of leverage nonetheless left scars. He justified these measures as triage. When institutions weaponize secrecy, leverage becomes a tool of defense. Still, each use of leverage felt like a small surrender. The personal cost deepened. Mara's absence had become a quiet ache that did not dull. She had not abandoned him. She had set a boundary and chosen a different path. Their correspondence was careful and infrequent. When they spoke, she asked him to remember the people who would be harmed by his choices and to keep the ledger of consequences in view. Her private thoughts, fear, sorrow, a steady practical wisdom, were a constant ache. He tried to honor her counsel, but the campaign's momentum had its own gravity. One night, after a day of hearings and a clandestine meeting with a whistleblower who had risked everything to hand over a cache of documents, he sat alone in the clinic's dim office. The city outside was a lattice of lights, each one a private life. He pressed his palm to the notebook and wrote, in a hand that trembled with fatigue and resolve, "If you will shrink the world, do so to enlarge trust. Let sufficiency be a choice, not a sentence. Protect the vulnerable. Do not let righteous ends justify cruelty." The line felt like both a command and a prayer. He had moved from defending a single client to challenging the logic of accumulation itself. The arrests had shown him the limits of exposure and the dangers of a state that could redefine dissent as a threat. The work ahead would demand more than tactics. It would demand a moral imagination capable of holding both the need to dismantle and the duty to rebuild. He closed the notebook and walked into the night, knowing that the next phase would test not only his skill but his soul, and that the city's private chorus would keep singing, indifferent to the plans of men who thought they could rearrange the world. The Great Shift. The arrests had cracked something open in the city's skin. What had once been a contest of documents and hearings became a contest of endurance. Who could outlast the other? Who could absorb the legal costs, the reputational blows, the slow attrition of allies? He watched the network's energy thin in places and thicken in others. Cooperatives that had been fragile grew stubborn, while some journalists retreated under pressure. The campaign's center of gravity shifted from public spectacle to subterranean work, fortifying, hiding, teaching. And with that shift came a new clarity about what the next phase must be. Escalation and international reach. The movement's revelations had attracted attention beyond the city. International NGOs, academic centers, and a few sympathetic foreign journalists began to map the procurement chains and offshore conduits he had exposed. Some offered solidarity, others offered caution. Foreign governments, watching the instability with a mixture of curiosity and alarm, sent envoys who asked questions that were both polite and probing. He read their private calculations as easily as he read a clerk's. Geopolitical risk, investment exposure, the optics of being seen to support a movement that challenged centralized authority. The global gaze complicated the campaign. It offered resources and protection in some quarters, and it offered new vectors for delegitimization in others. He used the attention strategically. International pressure could be a shield. When a cooperative faced a sudden audit, a foreign NGO's statement could make a municipal official think twice. Grants from abroad funded training programs and micro-grants for displaced workers. But the attention also risked turning the movement into a foreign project in the eyes of nationalist politicians. He learned to calibrate exposure, accept what helped build capacity, refuse what would be used to paint the network as an external threat. The ledger of alliances grew more complex. Every new friend carried a potential cost. The betrayal. Betrayal arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow, corrosive leak. One of the operatives he had trusted most, a mid-level analyst who had provided redacted memos and procedural maps, began to act differently. Small mistakes accumulated. A secure cache left in a place that was too easy to find. A contact who failed to show up at a safe house. A hesitation in a moment that required decisiveness. He read the analyst's private thoughts and found fear, yes, but also a new calculation. Self-preservation mixed with the hope of a quiet exit. The man had been offered a transfer, a pension, a promise of safety if he stepped away. The state's containment strategy had always included carrots as well as sticks. When the betrayal became public, a leak that exposed a whistleblower's identity and led to an arrest, the network reeled. The operative's motives were not simple malice. They were the arithmetic of a person who had been squeezed and offered a way out. The moral complexity of the betrayal cut deeper than any straightforward treachery. He felt anger, of course, but also a profound sorrow. The state had learned how to buy silence and how to make survival feel like complicity. The ledger recorded the loss with a new line. Account for the human calculus of fear. Build exits that do not require betrayal. The decision to shift tactics. The betrayal hardened his resolve. He had always tried to avoid coercion and to prioritize repair, but the state's capacity to co-opt and to punish had shown him that restraint alone might not be enough. The plan that had been sketched in notebooks, to shrink the scale of accumulation and to make centralized extraction unreliable, now demanded a bolder posture. He convened a small council of elders, the former analyst who had remained loyal, a few trusted lawyers, and the technicians who had built the microgrids. They argued late into the night about ethics and risk, about consent and the possibility of unintended harm. From those debates emerged a decision. The campaign would escalate in a way that combined *targeted systemic disruption with *accelerated construction of alternatives *, but it would do so under a stricter moral code. The code required 3 things. First, ** consent and participation wherever possible. Second, ** prearranged social protections for those likely to be harmed by disruptions. Third, ** transparency within the network so that decisions were accountable to community councils rather than to a single mind. He wrote the code into the ledger and made it a ritual. Before any operation, a council would convene, elders would be consulted, and contingency funds would be allocated. The operation, a surgical strike on scale. The first operation under the new code was surgical and audacious. They targeted a regional clearinghouse that had become the linchpin for large-scale procurement, a digital platform that automated scoring and routed contracts to a narrow set of vendors. The clearinghouse's opacity had been the engine of capture. Algorithms tuned to favor scale, vendor registries that privileged firms with political ties, and a culture that rewarded speed over scrutiny. If the clearinghouse could be made unreliable, even temporarily, municipalities would be forced to rely on local knowledge and manual verification, a window for cooperatives to bid and for communities to assert oversight. Technicians introduced a set of benign anomalies into the clearinghouse's data flows, timestamps that required manual verification, metadata flags that elevated social value metrics, and a cascade of innocuous errors that forced human review. The changes were reversible and designed to avoid physical harm. The effect was immediate. Tenders that had been foregone conclusions open to new bidders. Procurement officers, forced to review bids manually, found themselves confronted with local cooperatives that could deliver at lower social cost. The clearinghouse's operators scrambled to patch the anomalies, and in the scramble they revealed internal memos that showed how the system had been tuned to favor certain firms. The leak of those memos to sympathetic journalists produced a public outcry. For a moment, the city's procurement logic faltered. Contracts were paused, hearings were called, and community oversight boards were given a seat at the table. The operation had worked, not by destroying infrastructure, but by forcing human attention back into a process that had been automated to conceal favoritism. The victory felt like a proof of concept. Systems could be nudged to reveal their seams, and those seams could be used to open space for alternatives. The human cost and the moral audit. Even as the operation succeeded, the human cost surfaced. A small subcontractor who had relied on a major firm's steady contracts found itself without work when a contract was paused. Workers who had been paid irregularly for months suddenly faced a gap in income. The network's emergency funds were deployed, retraining programs were offered, and community councils negotiated temporary contracts to keep people employed. The ledger recorded the episode with a new, heavy line. Even surgical strikes create ripples. Plan for every ripple. He convened the moral audit the next morning. The council reviewed the operation, the contingencies, and the outcomes. They acknowledged the success and the harms. They tightened protocols. Future disruptions would require prearranged transitional employment plans, guaranteed stipends for affected workers, and a public communications strategy that explained the purpose and the protections. The audit was not a ritual of absolution. It was a mechanism of accountability that sought to keep the campaign tethered to its ethical core. The cultural work intensifies. Parallel to the operations, the cultural campaign deepened. The repair fairs and seed exchanges became more than symbolic acts. They were training grounds for a new civic competence. Apprentices taught neighbors how to maintain microgrids, elders taught seed-saving techniques, and artists created public works that told stories of mutual aid. The narrative shifted in neighborhoods where people saw tangible benefits, local jobs, faster repairs, and a sense of agency. The cultural work was slow but durable. It created the social glue that made alternatives plausible. He also invested in education, curricula that taught cooperative governance, legal literacy workshops that explained how to use bylaws to protect communal assets, and public forums where elders and technicians debated the ethics of scale. The aim was to make sufficiency not merely a policy preference, but a practiced habit. If people could see that local systems could meet their needs reliably, the political appetite for centralized extraction would wane. The cliff edge. The operation's success did not end the contest. It sharpened it. The state responded with a new set of measures, targeted audits of cooperatives, legal suits that tested the limits of the new bylaws, and a propaganda campaign that framed the network as reckless. The security apparatus intensified surveillance, and the risk of arrests and asset freezes rose again. The network's resilience had improved, but so had the state's capacity for containment. He stood on the riverbank one night. The city's lights a constellation of small economies and private anxieties. The ledger in his pocket felt heavier than ever. He had moved from defending a single client to orchestrating a campaign that sought to reconfigure the scale of modern life. The victories were real, and the harms were real. The moral code he had written into the ledger guided him, but it did not make the choices easy. He closed the notebook and wrote a single line that felt like both a vow and a warning. Shrink the levers of extraction. Enlarge the circle of care. Never let the means eclipse the ends. The words were a compass and a confession. The next phase would demand more than tactics and cultural work. It would demand a test of whether a movement born of legal defense and moral imagination could become a durable politics of sufficiency without becoming an instrument of coercion. The city hummed around him, indifferent and alive, and the private chorus of thoughts, fear, hope, calculation, braided into the night. The long winter. Winter arrived with a clarity that made every breath visible, and the city's lights looked like a constellation of small, brittle promises. The campaign had moved from improvisation to institution. Federated cooperatives, legal shields, mirrored caches, and a network of people who could read the seams of power and act. Yet the state's countermeasures had also matured. Emergency statutes, expanded surveillance, and a politics of stability hardened into a season of attrition. The long winter was not only meteorological, it was political and moral. It tested endurance, patience, and the capacity to keep a promise to the vulnerable. He spent the season in a rhythm of small, urgent tasks and long, reflective nights. Mornings were for the cooperatives, visits to microgrid sites, meetings with waterworks crews, and training sessions where apprentices learned to solder, to test pH levels, to read meters. Afternoons were for legal work, drafting motions, preparing constitutional challenges, and negotiating with municipal officials who still believed that order could be bought with procedural language. Evenings were for the ledger, ethical audits, minutes of councils, and the ritual confessions that had become a practice of accountability. The work was granular and human. It was also the slow accumulation of capacity that might, in time, make centralized extraction less effective. The network's social protections were the season's most important achievement. They had learned from earlier mistakes. Every disruption now came with a prearranged safety net. When a contract was paused, transitional employment clauses were triggered. When a cooperative faced an audit, emergency funds and legal teams mobilized. When a whistleblower's identity risked exposure, relocation and anonymity protocols were enacted. These measures were not perfect, but they reduced the immediate human cost of political struggle. They were the difference between a campaign that produced headlines and one that sustained lives. Yet the long winter also revealed the limits of mitigation. The state's legal apparatus had become a blunt instrument of attrition. Repeated audits drained time and resources. Regulatory reviews delayed projects until momentum stalled. Banks, pressured by official inquiries, froze accounts on technical pretexts. The network's lawyers fought in courtrooms and in public opinion, but the legal battles were slow and expensive. The campaign's energy thinned in places. Volunteers burned out. Some cooperatives folded under the weight of compliance. The ledger's margins filled with names and small tragedies. A family that lost a wage, a clinic that postponed a program, a youth who left the city for steadier work. He felt the attrition personally. The ability to read minds had always been a burden. Now it was a constant ache. He could sense the exhaustion in the apprentices, private thoughts, the fear in elders who had seen cycles of hope and disappointment, and the quiet resentment in municipal staff who felt besieged. He tried to hold those feelings without letting them harden into contempt. He convened listening circles where people could speak without fear of being used as evidence. He insisted on rest cycles and on rotating responsibilities. He pushed for rituals of repair, public acknowledgments of harm, restitution funds, and days when the network simply cooked and ate together. The long winter also sharpened the moral code he had written into the ledger. The council's rituals became stricter. Every operation required a written ethical audit, a plan for mitigation, and a public explanation tailored to the communities most affected. The code was not a bureaucratic formality. It was a discipline that kept the network tethered to its purpose. He enforced it with a rigor that sometimes felt like self-punishment. He refused to authorize operations that lacked contingency plans. He refused to use leverage that would humiliate individuals. He refused, most of all, to let the campaign become a vehicle for personal vengeance. But the state's pressure produced new temptations. The security apparatus's reach had become more surgical, targeted freezes, selective prosecutions, and the use of administrative law to punish without trial. The network's allies were vulnerable in ways that legal shields could not always protect. In private, some members argued for more aggressive tactics, sabotage of administrative systems, public shaming of officials, and the routine use of leverage to force compliance. The debates were bitter. He resisted, but the resistance cost him allies and sleep. The long winter demanded a kind of moral stamina that was harder than any legal argument. A crisis crystallized the season's tensions. A regional food distribution contract, long suspected of favoritism, was paused after a coordinated exposure. The pause should have been an opening for local suppliers. Instead, a confluence of hoarding by private distributors and delayed municipal response produced shortages in several outlying neighborhoods. The network mobilized emergency kitchens and rerouted supplies, but the episode left a scar. Critics accused the movement of recklessness. Supporters pointed to the long-term benefits of breaking a corrupt chain. He convened a public audit, apologized where the network had failed to anticipate the cascade, and restructured protocols to prevent similar outcomes. The ledger recorded the episode as a wound and a lesson. In the long winter, the personal and the political braided tightly. Mara's absence remained a quiet ache. She had not abandoned him. She had chosen a different path, one that prioritized local, consensual work over clandestine campaigns. Their correspondence was careful and full of the things people say when love and ethics collide. She urged him to remember the people who would be harmed by his choices and to keep the ledger's rules as a moral compass. He tried to honor her counsel, but the campaign's momentum had its own gravity. The long winter taught him that endurance required not only tactics, but the capacity to live with the consequences of one's choices. By spring, the city's light softened. The cooperatives that had survived the winter were stronger. New apprentices had been trained. The ledger's rituals had become a public practice of accountability. The long winter had thinned the movement but also clarified its core. Build capacity, protect the vulnerable, and keep the circle of care wide. He had learned that dismantling extraction required more than exposure. It required the patient work of building alternatives that could sustain people through political storms. The lesson was costly and humbling, but it was also the foundation for the next phase of the campaign. The Great Unraveling. The spring that followed the long winter carried a sense of brittle possibility. The network had hardened into a distributed polity, federated cooperatives, legal shields, mirrored archives, and a culture of mutual aid. The city's political center, however, had also consolidated new powers. Emergency statutes remained on the books, surveillance infrastructure had been upgraded, and the security apparatus had learned to weaponize administrative law. The contest had become a test of endurance and imagination. Could a distributed network outlast a centralized state that had the resources to punish and the rhetoric to justify it? He decided to escalate in a way that was both strategic and symbolic. The plan was not to topple the state, but to make the levers of large-scale extraction unreliable across a broader geography. If procurement capture and opaque financial conduits were the arteries of extraction, then clogging those arteries in multiple regions would force a reconfiguration of incentives. The operation would be coordinated, surgical, and accompanied by a massive rollout of alternatives: microgrids, water cooperatives, seed banks, and legal forms that protected communal assets. The aim was to create a new baseline of sufficiency that reduced the political power of extractive actors. The operation's architecture was complex. Technicians introduced benign anomalies into regional procurement platforms, forcing manual verification and opening tenders to local bidders. Forensic accountants traced offshore conduits and leaked documents to journalists who could contextualize the evidence without sensationalism. Legal teams filed motions that forced hearings and created public records. At the same time, the network accelerated the deployment of alternatives. Modular microgrids were installed in dozens of neighborhoods. Water purification cooperatives expanded distribution, and cooperative bakeries and repair shops were certified and connected to community procurement frameworks. The operation's first weeks were a cascade of revelations and mobilizations. Contracts that had been foregone conclusions opened to competition. Local suppliers won bids. Community oversight boards were given seats at procurement tables. The public saw tangible benefits: faster repairs, local jobs, and a sense of agency. The cultural campaign, repair fairs, seed exchanges, and public rituals amplified the material gains with narratives that reframed sufficiency as dignity. For many neighborhoods, the changes were immediate and life-improving. But the state's response was swift and severe. Emergency powers were invoked with a rhetoric of national stability. Banks froze accounts on technical pretexts. Regulatory reviews targeted cooperatives with a zeal that suggested political intent. The security apparatus launched a campaign of disinformation that painted the network as a foreign-funded destabilizing force. Arrests followed: a journalist detained on dubious charges, a cooperative leader accused of financial impropriety, a whistleblower's identity exposed and weaponized. The state's instruments were blunt and effective. The network's gains were fragile. The campaign's moral center was tested like never before. The network had planned contingencies, emergency funds, relocation protocols, and legal defenses. Still, the human cost mounted. Workers lost wages when contracts were paused. Families faced uncertainty when bank accounts were frozen. Activists endured harassment and legal peril. He convened councils, tightened ethical reviews, and insisted on transparency within the network. He also authorized more aggressive leverage in targeted cases, exposing dossiers that tied officials to corrupt networks, using the threat of disclosure to force resignations and restitution, and structuring deals that redirected illicit gains into community funds. Each use of leverage was accompanied by mitigation plans, but the ledger's margins filled with names and small tragedies. The moral calculus reached a breaking point when a coordinated clampdown targeted a cluster of cooperatives that had become central to the network's resilience. The state used administrative law to freeze assets and to suspend operations on the pretext of regulatory noncompliance. The move was surgical and devastating. Neighborhoods that relied on cooperative water systems faced interruptions. Microgrids lost access to critical components, and food distribution networks were strained. The network mobilized emergency responses, but the scale of the clampdown revealed the limits of decentralized resilience in the face of coordinated state power. In the midst of the clampdown, a betrayal of a different kind surfaced. An ally, a regional coordinator who had been instrumental in scaling microgrids, was revealed to have been negotiating with state officials for a personal exit, promises of safety, a pension, and a quiet life in exchange for information that could be used to dismantle parts of the network. The revelation was a blow. The coordinator's motives were not simple greed. They were the arithmetic of fear and exhaustion. The state's strategy of carrots and sticks had worked in places. The betrayal forced a painful reckoning. The network had to build exits and protections that did not require people to choose between survival and complicity. The unraveling accelerated. The state's legal maneuvers created a climate of uncertainty that made it harder for cooperatives to operate. International attention, once a shield, became a liability as nationalist politicians used foreign grants to paint the movement as externally driven. The public conversation polarized further. Some citizens, frightened by the rhetoric of instability, supported the state's clampdown. Others, outraged by the apparent overreach, rallied in defense of the cooperatives. The city felt like a wound that would not close. He faced a choice that had been looming since the campaign's earliest days: continue to escalate and risk greater harm, or step back and consolidate the gains that remained. The ledger's rules: protect the vulnerable, minimize harm, build the village while you break the machine, guided him. He convened a council that included elders, legal advisors, technicians, and community representatives. They debated late into the night, weighing the moral calculus of further escalation against the immediate needs of people on the ground. The decision was to pivot. The network would not surrender its aims, but it would shift from large-scale disruption to deep consolidation. The focus would be on hardening the cooperatives that remained, expanding legal protections, and building international coalitions that could provide diplomatic pressure and material support. The pivot was not retreat. It was a strategic reorientation toward durability. It acknowledged the limits of what a single network could do against a state willing to use its full apparatus. The pivot required painful trade-offs. Some operations were suspended, certain exposures were delayed, resources were redirected to emergency relief and legal defense. The pivot also demanded a renewed commitment to the ledger's moral code. Every decision would be audited publicly. Every operation would require community consent where possible, and every disruption would be paired with a plan for social protection. The pivot was a test of whether the movement could translate moral imagination into durable politics without becoming an instrument of coercion. As the city moved into a tense summer, the network's energy shifted from spectacle to repair. The cooperatives that survived the clampdown became models of resilience, legally protected, community-governed, and materially capable of sustaining neighborhoods. The campaign's rhetoric softened into a pedagogy of sufficiency. The ledger's rituals, confessions, repairs, and public audits became a practice of civic life. The great unraveling had not ended the movement. It had forced it to become less dramatic and more durable. He felt both relief and sorrow. The cost had been high, and the ledger's margins were full of names he could not forget. The ledger and the last question. Years later, when the city's skyline had shifted and the cooperatives had become a visible part of urban life, he found himself in a different rhythm, less the urgent pace of clandestine operations and more the slow, reflective work of tending legacy. The campaign had not toppled the state, nor had it returned the world to a romanticized primitivism. What it had done, imperfectly and painfully, was to create durable alternatives that reduced the scale of centralized extraction in many neighborhoods, and to seed a public imagination that valued sufficiency and mutual aid. The ledger remained his constant companion. It recorded not only operations and outcomes, but confessions and repairs. He had learned to treat the ledger as a public practice. Minutes of ethical audits were shared with community councils. Confessions were read aloud in gatherings where elders and apprentices listened and offered counsel. Repairs were documented and funded through community restitution programs. The ledger's transparency was not total. Some operational details remained confidential to protect lives, but its moral core was public. The practice had become a civic technology, a ritual that taught accountability and humility. He stepped back from frontline operations and focused on teaching. He taught seminars that combined law, ethics, and civic practice. Students, apprentices, elders, municipal officials, and curious citizens learned to design interventions that prioritized consent, repair, and durability. The pedagogy emphasized listening to communities, to elders, and to the ledger's margins. He taught that power must be tethered to practices that enlarge trust rather than concentrate control. The classroom became a place where the movement's lessons could be translated into institutions that might outlast any single life. Mara returned in a different season. She had spent years working with rural cooperatives and teaching practices of sufficiency. Their reunion was careful and full of the things people say when love and ethics have been tested. She did not return to the city to rejoin clandestine campaigns. She returned to teach and to help build the cultural infrastructure that sustained the cooperatives. Their conversations were honest and sometimes painful. She asked him again and again whether the ledger's rules had held and whether the movement had become what it had sought to prevent. He answered with the ledger open between them, reading aloud confessions and repairs, and together they listened to the city's private chorus with a humility that felt like a benediction. The world did not become primitive. Markets continued to exist, states retained power, technologies advanced. But in many neighborhoods, the scale of life had shifted. People measured success by the health of their commons, by the reliability of local systems, and by the depth of mutual aid. Property remained, but its moral framing had changed in places. Communal trusts protected shared assets, procurement frameworks prioritized social value, and legal forms made it harder for extractive actors to capture public goods. The change was uneven and contested, but it was real. He grew older in a way that felt like a settling rather than a decline. The ability to read minds remained a private burden and a private gift. He used it less as a tool of intervention and more as a practice of care. To sense when a counsel needed rest, when an apprentice required encouragement, when an elder's story needed to be heard. He taught others the rituals of confession and repair so that the ledger would not be a single person's archive, but a communal practice. The final chapters of his public life were quiet. He advised municipal councils on how to embed community oversight into procurement law. He helped draft national guidelines for cooperative governance that protected communal assets from predatory seizure. He supported international networks that shared lessons about sufficiency and legal innovation. He did not claim victory. He claimed only stewardship. The ledger's last pages were not triumphalist, but careful. Lists of practices, templates for bylaws, and a set of ethical maxims that read like a covenant. On his last ledger day as an active steward, he stood before a circle of apprentices, elders, municipal partners, and friends. He read aloud a confession from early in the campaign, a moment when a disruption had produced unintended scarcity and the repair that followed. He did not seek absolution. He sought to teach the practice of accountability. When he finished, the circle rose and sang an elder's song that braided past and present. The sound felt like a benediction. He walked home along the riverbank with Mara at his side. The city's lights shimmered on the water, and the ledger in his bag felt like a small, heavy book of vows. He pressed his palm to the pendant he had carried for years, a private warmth that had steadied him in moments of doubt, and felt its familiar heat. He thought of the apprentices who now led cooperatives, of the elders who had taught songs to the archive, and of the many hands that had learned to hold one another steady. His final ledger entry that night was simple and unadorned. Leave the door open, teach the ledger. Let the future be a conversation, not a possession. The pendant warmed in agreement. He closed the ledger, not with the sense of an ending, but with the steady expectation of continuation. A practice that had learned to pass the torch and to keep the flame alive through many hands. The world remained imperfect and contested, but in the margins, in the cooperatives, the repair fairs, the seed banks, and the rituals of confession and repair, he saw the signs of a life that could endure. The last question, the one that had haunted him since the first invoice and the first arrest, remained. Had he done more good than harm? The ledger offered no tidy answer. It offered instead a record of choices, of confessions and repairs, of lives saved and lives disrupted. He had tried to hold both the need to dismantle and the duty to rebuild. In the end, he trusted the practice he had helped create. That power must be accountable, that communities must be able to sustain themselves, and that the measure of any advance is how it widens the circle of care. He walked toward the lights with a steady step, ready to listen for the next question the world would ask.